Thank you. Hi. Oh, it's on. Yeah. Oh.
Okay, so now we're live again. Just as the formalities, I will remind you this is not a private conversation and will be made available to the public. We want it to be enjoyable and comfortable, so if at any time it is not either of those things, just let me know and we will correct that. So today is Thursday, September 26, 2019. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm interviewing Henry Kahn here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And once again, if I can get your verbal consent to be recorded.
All right, consent.
So this is a follow-up interview from the first sitting that we had back on September 12th, where we covered a lot of your family's origins and your childhood, adolescence, up through college, with a couple of little detours into the future. So today, let's start, I think, around the time that you entered medical school.
Sure enough, by the last 2 years of college, I pretty well had decided I was going to become a med school applicant. Because I was studying biochemistry, it wasn't a big assault on my course selection. I was pretty well prepared, or would be by the time I finished senior year, and went through the application process, which was interesting. I'll just comment briefly. I wasn't accepted at every medical school to which I applied. The first interview I had was at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, part of Columbia University, New York City. I took the train down from Boston, Cambridge, down to New York.
Because your undergraduate was at Harvard.
Yeah, I was an undergraduate, still at Harvard, applying in the process to go to medical school without a year's gap. You know, it was going to go right on, right through. And I had just one interviewer there, and he looked over my record, and I could barely get a word in edgewise. He discovered there that I had been an officer of the Harvard Radcliffe Socialist Club in my application, because I put it on the application. And he was livid. He gave me a monologue that probably went on 20 minutes, might have been more, but maybe it was only 8 minutes, but it felt terrible. I said, oh my God, here's the end of this is dead end. He accused me of being an enemy of the common man if I was at all interested in socialism, because I didn't get the argument, I didn't understand it, but apparently socialists would terrorize doctors and make it impossible for them to do their work. Therefore, I was an enemy of the common man. And actually, I can't remember where I stayed. I think at that point my mother may have lived in New York City and had an apartment. I probably stayed with her. The next day I took the train back to Boston, and whenever it was, possibly a weekend gap, and then Monday, I already had my rejection letter from Columbia University. On the basis of that one interview in which I really got a word in.
And Matt, his response was, as I understand it, not very uncommon. Like, this was the main position of, like, the American Medical Association, was
yes.
it not?
Well, I am sure it was, but I don't know if they bothered to waste their breath collectively on socialism. Everybody knew that socialism was terrible, but he certainly did, and not a good sign. But a couple of weeks later, I had my interview at Harvard Medical School. I don't mean to make this proof of the difference between Columbia and Harvard, because it could have been randomly exactly the reverse. But the application said the same thing. It was basically copied and pasted before there was copying and pasting. And I was assigned to interview with the assistant dean of the Harvard Dental School, which shared an application process with the medical school. The students actually were in the same classes for most of the first 2 years. he was affable, he was friendly, he smiled a lot, he had a paisley tie and tweed jacket and penny loafers like many Ivy League professors of that period. Tortoiseshell, eyeglasses. He said, "Wonderful to meet you. How do you do? Welcome. I'm glad you're applying here. I've looked over your record," he said, "your application, and I see you were active in the Harvard Radcliffe Socialist Club." Fascinating. He said, "I don't believe I've ever met a socialist before." And we had a nice conversation, and we went in lots of other areas, and the end of the story is I got in. Didn't help, or it didn't hurt, I should say. Maybe it didn't help, but it didn't hurt that I had very good grades, and I was on the dean's list for many, that's the good list, not the bad list, the dean's list for many semesters, maybe all of them, I don't think so, but most of them. So anyway, I got in, and I had a few episodes of the heavy hand coming down on my behavior during medical school, but it really wasn't as bad as I feared. It was pretty good. My classmates tolerated me, and some of them appreciated my opportunities during lectures. We had format, which was, how many class members did we have? I think it was 120 in the class. Yeah, and then in later years it goes up to 160 because some two-year medical schools send their rising third-year students into Harvard, so we went from 120 to 160. But our lectures were in big amphitheaters, classically designed, steep benches, and hair professor way down in the middle. And they were structured usually around an hour and a half. It was a great opportunity to see all my classmates, those who came to lecture at one time. And at the end, once a week, once every 2 weeks, I would stand up and say, "Wait a minute," and point out that we were having sit-ins. These were alert students. They knew there were sit-in movements going on in the South, moving up to the inner city, Boston, New York, Chicago. There's a request for medical students to come help at Tent City down in the South End. It'll be tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. Come on down. Or the war in Vietnam is going on, and increasingly my classmates knew that was happening, although few of them did in the...
Because what year did you enter medical?
I entered medical school in '68. And it was reaching public consciousness then, but I had been studying that since '62, roughly. And I was well rehearsed in the horrors of what we had initiated or perpetuated on the behalf of the French since Dien Bien Phu in 1955. Anyway, they knew I was the go-to person to make an announcement. At the end of the lecture, I could rarely get in more than 15 to 30 seconds of, "Hey, I'm telling you, we've got to do this," and I had the adequate voice to get a little bit of attention. Most students would drift out, and a few would stay behind and ask me for details, and that established my bona fides as the activist, radical in the class. There were a few others who routinely shared their interest, but few of them were as outspoken as I was. As it was organized, I should tell you about our dissection table. In year one, 4 students worked together on a cadaver. It's part of the classical training. I think students still do that, but it must be different in some ways now. In my case, there were 2 women among the 4 of us. And that was unusual because I think there were only 7 women in the whole class. I don't know how that happened, but we had nothing to do with choosing each other, but gave me a good chance to get to know Judith Herman very well. She was one of my dissection partners. And she now is retired from Harvard's Department of Psychiatry as one of the world authorities on sexual abuse and violence against women. we had no trouble converging, sharing interests. It was a good experience, and actually I mentioned that I did well in anatomy. I enjoyed anatomy. I enjoyed dealing with a body. We expressed at our table many concerns about sensitivity and respect for the body from whom we learned so much. And other students got that, although some didn't. But in my circle of 4, it was considered and addressed, and we went on, and that was one of the classes in which I think, got an A. Must be true, because they asked me to stay on the next year and return to the anatomy lab as an assistant, they call it prosector, to help the next year students go through it. So, they asked me to do that. It didn't take a lot of time, a couple of days out of the semester. And so that was good. I thought at that point I was really a pretty good medical student. I certainly passed, and I did adequately on my national boards, which come at the end of the first 2 years. It turns out, I've learned when I've since seen my transcript, that I didn't do well all through medical school, but thanks God for Harvard's preference of not discussing your grades with you unless there's a real problem. So I wasn't that bad off, but when I saw my transcript after 25 years, and I can't remember the context in which I received my transcript, but it wasn't a sterling student. I got a few A's, but an awful lot of mediocre grades as well, probably reflecting the tension that, especially in the clinical rotations, which come in year 3 and 4, where you go be an otolaryngologist for 6 weeks, you go be a pediatrician for 8 weeks, you go do, and you work under supervision of faculty members who are often also private physicians. I think the word was out that I was a troublemaker and would raise unnecessary questions, and they sometimes probed me. What do you think? Oh, yeah. And I guess my less than stellar grades might be attributed to that. But in truth, by the end of 2nd year, moving into 3rd and 4th year, there were so many things moving quickly in our political and international sphere that I probably spent more time than other students in organizing demonstrations, going to meetings about political things. So it wouldn't surprise me to know that my performance was less than the top of the class. But I never was called in and told I was doing badly. I was called in by the dean, beginning of the clinical years, beginning of 3rd year. He said, we're aware of your political persuasions and your activism. We're not here to tell you you can't do it, but you need to be mindful that this may represent some sort of interference with your medical education. We don't know in what form it will come. We don't want to see you get hurt. It was sort of cautious. I can't remember the words, but it was on one occasion from the dean of students, and on a different occasion from the dean himself. Both of them purported to be avuncular, we're trying to make sure you don't have problems. The price I paid was in their recommendation, which I accepted, that I not seek or accept a rotation through the Veterans Administration hospitals. They said, someone will identify you as an opponent of the war in Vietnam, and this is not a time to be seen that way in the veterans hospitals. Because there were already vets coming back by 66, 67, 68 with horrendous stories. And maybe the fear was that I would provoke a truth-telling, or I just would be perceived as not sympathetic. So I accepted that. Downstream, decades later, I regret that I could not have participated in the one socialized medical system that our country has. It's still, to this day, if you are asked, what's the socialized largest system in North America? It's not Canada, it's the Veterans Administration of the United States, because those are not just socialized insurance, that's a socialized system. The doctors are employees of the state, and they work entirely within the state structure, and their pay is not connected to how many patients they can turn through the turnstile. And I would like to have seen that then, because it always has been an interesting example. So intermittently corrupt, intermittently underfunded, but an example of how we could have and still do have a socialized medical system. So I missed that in medical school. In my surging activism, I also gave some talks at other medical schools up in the East area, East Coast. And while in New York City, I gave a talk to the New York Student Health Organization members, a dozen people, and one of them was Felicia Hance, and we hit it off real well. Long story short, we had a whirlwind, complex, romantic evolution stretching between New York City and Boston. And by the end of third year, we had decided to get married. And that she was a year behind me, so that required, as we preferred, that we go to the same city. Mm-hmm. And she had good grades. Because she was becoming my wife, Harvard accepted her as an entering third-year student while I became a fourth-year student. So we had a marriage which was not very satisfying. It was based on a lot of wonderful romantic philosophical convergences, but they didn't fulfill all the stages I should have been able to have as a young adult. I mean, we barely had time for each other in any other personal way. We put together an apartment, we entertained friends, but we hardly ever saw each other. I mean, it's a very busy, structured life. And in addition, she was a heavy smoker, which was not uncommon then among medical students, and worst of all, in some ways, among women, as among nursing students who were notoriously heavy smokers in that era. That's off the point. Felicia and I divorced after just under 2 years of marriage. While I was entering internship, and she was, or in the middle of my internship, she was in the middle of her final year at Harvard Medical School, from which she graduated. She went on to become a vigorous proponent of women's rights, an OBGYN. In fact, she was tapped by Bill Clinton to be Undersecretary of State for Population Affairs, regarding the international provision of contraception. But by then she was already married to somebody else who himself was an OBGYN. That marriage didn't last either, but she did have children with him and not with me. So our amicable separation and divorce was childless, made it easier, and we didn't have. Of course we were in pain around the failure of the marriage, but subsequently she and I and my wife, Mickey, to whom I returned later, and her husband, from their life in California together. All four of us at one point were co-authors in various chapters in a textbook on contraceptive practice. So it was amicable enough that we could write together. Mm-hmm. And I've never met, I met her husband at the joint author's reception for the book. I never met her children, and when she died of lung cancer a decade ago, I sent a message to her children, and a short note of a few short paragraphs, reminiscing about her strong points and career, and they didn't respond to me. I'm sure they knew who I was because her husband acknowledged me at a dinner we all went to together about the publication of our book. He said, well, one of the reasons I came across the country for this dinner is I wanted to meet Henry Kahn. I've been hearing about him. It was not as bad as it might have been, a breakup. While in medical school, my activism was not framed on socialism, but I did do a lot of support for the inner city housing campaigns, in which the South End neighborhood, not far from where Harvard Medical School is in Boston, was going through the beginnings of gentrification. It had gone from what was 19th century elegant brownstones into a 20th century slum, and just beginning to bounce back. And gentrification was extremely hard on the homeless people who lived there, especially around Boston City Hospital, which was located in the South End. And so the encampments of the tent cities that were built for the increasingly impoverished South End residents called for help from medical students, and I was active with that. And our student health organization in Boston, which had equal memberships approximately from Harvard, Tufts, and Boston University School of Medicine, we worked together with some nursing students and social work students, and we, among other things, set up a free clinic in a housing project in Boston. We saw just small numbers of patients, but it was a token gesture of our impatience. We would like to help people besides learning about physiological lab preps and brain electrodes and other things that frankly were very interesting, but were just not preparing us to be doctors. Speaking of the curriculum, I recall near the end of second year peeking out my impatience with reluctance to deal with the world problems of health. I believe it's accurate that in the first 2 years, when we covered umbrella reviews of infectious diseases, neurologic diseases, cardiac diseases, as lecture topics, we had endless stuff about fascinating but irrelevant latest cutting-edge research from famous professors. I think we had 3 or 4 lectures on how the hormones change when the tadpole is resorbing his tail and becoming a frog. The resorption of the tadpole tail got 4 hours of lecture because there were some very interesting hormonal changes in the tadpole. And it's fascinating, but we didn't have 20 minutes on malaria. Or tuberculosis, a little bit more, maybe an hour. It just, and if we did, most of that was about a peculiar enzyme in the malaria parasite rather than how many people around the world die every hour of malaria. And, well, we don't have it in the United States much. We did have, but gosh, wouldn't that be sufficient justification to make that a topic that we should really dig in? No, never. And I had a major anxiety attack panic in class. I just said, I can't believe I'm doing this. It's driving me crazy. Why am I in this lecture hall wasting this kind of time when there's so many other things out there that we should be activated around? I actually had to get up. I felt like I was passing out. I stumbled down the row, the steep stairs, I had to stumble, climb over some laps, hang on to the railing, go up to the walkway behind the last row, and flee the amphitheater and go for a walk. I felt better in the next half hour. I got out onto Longwood Avenue, and fresh air felt good, and I survived the panic attack, but to a lesser degree, I had many episodes of agitation around those sort of things. In conjunction with a few local people and others, many more of them from other medical schools, we corresponded about forming a medical resistance union. We were being told, starting third-year medical school, that we were going to get drafted, and most of us were men. This is your chance to simplify your draft obligation by committing to the Berry Plan, which was named after, I guess, George Packer Berry, who was a previous dean of Harvard Medical School. No longer there, but his name was enshrined in the portraits. The Berry Plan was a deal with the Department of Defense. You commit to work for us as a high-level officer in a protected medical environment, and we will not draft you out of medical school. Well, that's not true. We were automatically all exempt by being in medical school. But as soon as we entered internship, our numbers started tick, 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 and usually, in the absence of the Berry Plan, we would have been drafted right after internship to be a low-level doctor coming into the Army doing awful things. Our basic mission would have been to just send soldiers back into battle, or to justify their being in battle by saying, we'll take care of you when you get hurt. And very complicated ethics there. And many of us saw the binds and the values. Almost all the men I know chose the Berry Plan and signed up for it. That was the default. Everybody did. But I refused to do it. So I was aware I was going to be at risk. And that similar thoughts occurred to student collaborators and student health organizations all over the country.
And was the Berry Plan, was this open to medical students at all medical schools?
Yes.
Or just?
Yes, I meant to say, it's not a Harvard thing. Just ironically, the Berry, I think it's the same Berry. I know that a previous much lauded dean of Harvard, George Packer Berry, was around that time. It must have been the same guy. But in any case, Berry Plan was available to anybody in a registered medical curriculum. So it means you go in as a major, or I don't even know the ranks. You go in at a high rank, and you're not just a lieutenant in the mud. You supervise a fancy ward and that sort of stuff. And that was what Harvard guys in particular expected to do. I said, I won't do that. I don't want any privilege of that sort for a war that I don't want to support. And so we agonized over what we would do and crafted a pledge that said we will not serve even as physicians in this war.
You and some of your peers.
Yeah, a small number of us. There's only 2 or 3 others at Harvard, but maybe 100 around the rest of the country signed the Medical Resistance Union, we called it. We published a 12-page brochure. I don't remember. It's a quick, small brochure. Here's our thinking. Here's what we said. And at the end, we said, we pledge we will commit ourselves, we will put ourselves in harm's way if we must. In other environments, we had a fantasy that the World Health Organization would accept us as volunteers, which is kind of silly. It wouldn't have happened in anything I know about the World Health Organization, but we said we'll find ways to put ourselves in harm's way. We're not shirking duty to humanity, but we don't want to support a war which we believe is manifestly unjust, wrong, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure what I can claim about the long-term outcome of that, but I think in most of the medical schools from which we came in the Medical Resistance Union, people were able to use that gesture to inform our classmates that this is not a slam dunk. There's something wrong with this structure. And I'm glad we did it. I mean, that was important. I'll come to that in my residency years when it came back again.
And just to follow up here, the activism that you were doing in the first 3-4 years of medical school.
It's only 4 years total.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was it? Sort of ad hoc around issues that most appealed to you?
It was often just speaking up, making a cogent 8-sentence announcement at the end of a physiology lecture, often unrelated to the lecture. Just saying, now that I've got you here, basically, remember, many of us are concerned, and there will be students of all parts of Boston coming together on the Common. They're protesting the war. If you can make it, I'll be there. You know, that sort of thing. And I would make, well, that was basically it within medical school campus. But that got me off the medical school campus to meet other students and meet other non-academic, non-student communities where they were, which I think made a difference because it made me perennially curious and connected to neighborhood community contexts in ways that most medical students don't allow themselves to do. They are passive about that. They don't recognize it to be an important thing. And the medical school did very little to recommend it. My best experience provided by the medical school was the one attempt to revise that. When I got into third year, I saw an announcement that although we had conventional blocks of so many weeks of this specialty, at this hospital, now you go to the Mass General for this, now you go to the Beth Israel Hospital for that, now you go to... There was an announcement that, are you interested in primary care, which means the provision of elementary services to big communities for common diseases with a preventive focus and a contextual focus. Why do we have this so much arthritis or Are you interested? We're announcing an experimental opportunity to do primary care. One element of that is continuity. So if you want to sign up, you can be connected to a preceptor and they'll see you once a week for a few hours. You'll have to be excused from your block elective and come to this little house we have on the edge of the Harvard Medical Campus. It was part of an office building that Harvard owned, but they made it into a two-room clinic or something, a small clinic. And this small group can have this opportunity to do primary care, continuous elective basis. And I signed up for that. I said, I want to get to, and they actually recommended that we do home visits as part of this, get to know the family, get to know, and we each followed one or two family. I followed a family that was identified through the pregnant woman. It was her first child. I got to meet her and her husband, learned to do prenatal examinations, learned to do household assessments, go to the house. It's an incredibly powerful experience, not only because I got to see the newborn. It was not at birth, although that would have been nice, couldn't pull it off. She would have allowed it, but I was busy holding a retractor in some other lab or something. But got to go to the house shortly, and I got to watch her sink into postpartum depression that was life-threatening. And I was engaged in ways that we never would have had otherwise in the OB class. You know, go to the house to see a woman who's become suicidal with a 2-month-old at home. You know, that sort of thing. And it gave me an opportunity to relate more closely with the small number of Harvard faculty members who thought this was a good idea. Harvard did not have a department of family practice or family medicine. Still, these instructors, collaborators, none of them was higher level than assistant professor at that time. Some of them later went on to become quite well-established academics, often after they left Harvard and went somewhere else. But the instructors there were really nice people. They encouraged that kind of curiosity and concern. And they would accompany us sometimes on the home visits, not always. One of them was a pediatrician who later became an active member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, but just a member, not a leader. Another was Victor Seidel, who was an internist at the Massachusetts General, trying to find his way in community medicine through building a computer system. Computers? Oh, for the Mass General Hospital. His way of looking at the big picture. Victor had previously thought he was going to be a biophysicist. You may have heard that from me before, studying the complex physics of the bacterial membrane. He didn't do well there. He, thinking of community medicine with a computer structure to make sense, we're talking 1967, 1968, was his next effort. At heart, he was a community physician. His 2-year or 3-year exploration of computer medicine was underappreciated, and he never went far in that. But he was one of the solid leaders helping to set up Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I became close to him through that connection. Victor later moved to New York and became professor and eventually the distinguished professor at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, of Social Medicine. And he wrote numerous books about primary care, often related to other countries, how they did it. So that was my good clinical experience. But it was limited to one afternoon a week for a little over a year. And that was punctuated by weekly threats from the supervising residents who would run us through their surgical rotation, or ENT rotation, or ophthalmology rotation. You're going away again? You're supposed to be here holding this retractor or writing notes or running lab tubes up and down the hallways. I said, I'm sorry, Wednesday afternoon is my time for primary care elective. What's that? Why are you doing that? And so that may have also contributed to the disaffection that I got from some of my evaluators. Unappreciation for some of my evaluators who wondered, why was I disappearing for a couple of hours every Wednesday afternoon to go do something weird like that? Are you sure the dean said this is okay? Well, the dean did say it was okay, but we didn't get a lot of support along the way. It was not appreciated, other than by Dr. Roseblum and Dr. Seidel, and they were the guys who knew what they were doing and tried to support us, but they were just junior faculty. So that was nice. That was my exposure to continuity of care, family medicine, and it does reflect much more positively what I wanted to get out of medical school, but I didn't get. Had I not gone in actively looking for that, it would have passed me right by. So I'm grateful to the young faculty members who set that up and allowed me to do that, but they put me in conflict situations every week. I can remember in the aggregate this horrible, so not just one person, it was 4 or 5 people at different rotations. Don't give me that crap again. You just start disappearing for whatever you do. I don't know. You're supposed to be here every afternoon doing what we tell you to do. Well, I'm lessened. So what else? I would say that covers it. I no longer in medical school had access to my favorite old retired professors across the river in Cambridge. I did have, in the 4th year rotation on internal medicine, which was probably as close as I was going to get to the field I wanted to pursue while at Harvard. I was assigned to the Beth Israel Hospital for that. Not a bad choice because it had early attempts to set up a working general medicine clinic that could be a primary care clinic, although they didn't call it that, but it was as close as you could get in Boston. There was a smaller but powerful example at the Massachusetts General, but I'd already been there for pediatrics, and that was not a particularly good experience. Pediatrics there was horrible. It was vicious, backbiting, no fun, no pleasure with the patients or their families. It was all academic. Get those enzyme samples over here because we're going to write a paper about this weird child, kind of stuff. But I was pretty happy at the medical rotation at the Beth Israel. The chief of medicine was briefly the ward attending, and that was helpful because he liked me and he knew my activist career history, and it didn't seem to scare him too bad. He was open to thinking about it. I got to meet a few of the old immigrant physicians who were still on the staff, but obviously way behind the science of the period. Doctors who had been immigrants before the Nazi period, during the Nazi period, often Jewish doctors, it's a Jewish hospital. And hearing their gentle wisdom from the 19th century or the early 20th century. But also, our ward rotations were frequently inclusive of Israeli residents who were coming to the States to build their careers with a couple of weeks at the hospital, and frequently, if they could get to the Beth Israel, they would because they're Jewish, and that was comfort for them. And in my medical rotation, I was doing ward rounds regularly with the ward team, which is usually 7 or 8 people, and 2 of them were Israeli surgeons, just a few years older than me, but they were finishing their preparation as surgeons. They probably knew a great deal about their field. I couldn't evaluate it, but they were surgeons, and as part of their year or 2 at the Beth Israel, they had to also go through medical rotation just to stay in touch with the medical issues that might bear on the surgical decision. That's not unreasonable, that's very. So there we were making rounds together during the war of 1967, the Yom Kippur War, which was the war in which, aided by the United States, the Israeli military suddenly attacked the Palestinian settlements around Israel and expanded the boundaries of modern Israel into the West Bank. And the conversation on the wards the next morning was really scary because there was this revelry. We showed them, I can't remember the words, all I remember is the affect. Whoa, we hit him hard, and we hit him hard. And I'm just sitting there saying, whoa, this is not good. And I just quietly, when someone looked at me and said, so what do you think? And I said, I think it's terrible. I really am worried about the militarism exhibited by Israel. I think this is destabilizing. I think it's terribly adventuristic on their part and the U.S. part to support them. The Yom Kippur War of 1967. And I wish I could feel good about it, but I certainly don't. I think it's a terrible thing that's happening. Late that evening, going out through the parking lot, I only lived a block and a half away, so I'm just walking home, but I went through the parking lot to get out to Longwood Avenue to get to my apartment. These two surgeons followed me out, and they grabbed me in between two cars, and they just pulled my clothes. They never actually hit me, but they threw me on the ground, and they said, you know, I can't remember the words. Basically, we don't appreciate what you said, and we don't need people like you. Worst of all, Jews like you who say that kind of stuff, because we're going to take over those Arab lands. Those lands should be Jewish lands, and you know, and they just left me there lying down, not bloody, but scared, in between two cars where no one could see me, down on the ground in the parking lot at the Beth Israel Hospital. I never turned them in. I didn't know what was I going to do, you know. If they had actually injured me, I would have had no choice but to turn them in, but no, they didn't. But they scared the shit out of me. Mm-hmm. That was maybe the most adverse consequences of my activism in that period. But it helped to establish my sympathy for the Palestinian cause in the face of manifest injustice that they experienced then in the Middle East and right up to the present. So I finished medical school in the celebrated MATCH system, M-A-T-C-H, which is how do you find out where your internship is going to be. Then it was, I don't know how they did it, I don't recall if computers were involved, but it was as if they were. You know, you put you get as many interviews as you want around the world, US, and you rank the ones you want, and the hospitals that have interviewed you rank the applicants they want. There's some formula, but I don't recall whether there were computers at the time. I rarely saw. There were, because Victor Seidel was working on computers, so there must have been a computerization, but it's nothing like the modern capabilities. Basically, you put it in the system and they hand out the result. And so I didn't get accepted at any Harvard hospital. I wanted to stay in Boston because my wife, soon not to be my wife, but I didn't quite organize it that way. She was finishing 1 year behind me. I was going to stay in Boston. I knew I could get through internship before the hammer of the draft came down on my neck, at which point I had planned to go to Canada. But I had not applied anything in Canada. I said, oh, I can put that off for months. And maybe I can work something out through a Harvard professor, a friend or something. But actually no Harvard hospital accepted me. I have to acknowledge that I wasn't the top of my class. But the guy who was at the top of his class also didn't get a Harvard hospital.
And how many Harvard hospitals are there?
Oh, well, 4 or 5 big ones, famous ones. And I didn't apply to the very minor ones, but you know, the Mass General. Boston City was unique in that it had the collaboration of 3 medical schools that all participated in funding this losing proposition, taking care of poor people. I'll do that. And the Harvard one, the Harvard service at Boston City was the most famous. It had very exotic laboratories in very, very old buildings, run by famous professors who set the world standard in a few fields of hematology and surgical trauma. It would have been a prize. But there was also their BU service and a Tufts service. So I applied to the Harvard service, to the BU service, and elsewhere in Boston to the Beth Israel, where I thought I'd get in, but I did not. And also, I can't remember where else, but just a few other hospitals around. Anyway, I was surprised. None of the Harvard hospitals accepted me, but the Boston University service at Boston City did accept me. But it wasn't a matter of choice at that point. That's where I go. Still not the bottom of the pile. It's a credible internship in the same campus with the Harvard service and the Tufts service, and frequently we had opportunities to go to meetings together or to share patients. And plus we had a lot of nonsense about turf wars within the hospital, which is a campus that's spread out over many buildings, most of which were close to 100 years old. Some of them were over 100 years old. Some of them didn't have alternating current in them. It was by far the most primitive medical campus, but that was touching, right? So I guess I need to deal with this. So
did you have pardon my ignorance, but had you declared a specialty?
That was internal medicine.
Okay.
Usually in that internal match, you specify the field.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was applying only in internal medicine. I thought about applying in family practice, but there were no family practice residencies in Boston. And we knew that was only for tiny medical schools in the Midwest somewhere where they don't know what they're doing. We don't have family practice here. So, okay. So in internal medicine, I matched only, you match one place, Boston City, on the BU medical service, not on the Harvard medical service. Some of my classmates from Harvard were on the Harvard service, and one of my classmates from Harvard was also on the BU service. He was the top of the class. He didn't get into the others. He was well known in the class because he was the only classmate with cerebral palsy. Brilliant guy with a slightly impaired slow speech and awkward hand gestures and slow gait coming down the street, unmistakable. But a nice guy. I didn't know him very well, although we occasionally drove together home because he came from Kingston, New York, and I was from Poughkeepsie, New York, 30 miles apart, so we might wind up finding ways to travel back and forth. My classmates, to their credit, were outraged. We all knew that Steve Pauker was the smartest guy in the class, and a nice guy, and a good physician. He just had cerebral palsy. The class, early in our internship year, found enough of each other to write a massive petition to the Mass General. We asked Steve, did you really want to go here? He said, no, I thought I was going to get into the Mass General, which would be the most prestigious destination. I don't know how many people signed it, but I was not the organizer of this, but I certainly endorsed it. I thought it was great. We said that we accuse the Mass General of prejudice. There's no reason to not make him the top choice. Why did you wind up only on the BU service at Boston City, where he and I were resident interns together, and we got along fine and helped each other a lot. He taught me things. Anyway, we lambasted the Mass General, and they made a small circle public apology for their poor criteria, and they welcomed Steve Bucker to become a Mass General first-year resident after internship. If you get through internship, we'll take you to Mass General for the subsequent years. So he went on there, and later I became a famous professor at Tufts, not at Harvard. May have been his choice, I don't really understand. So that's an interesting little anecdote. And I credit my classmates for coming up to that activist stance of saying, we don't think that's right. And maybe I had something to do with that because, I ceded the permission to be activist. things worth sharing about medical school. Well, or internship even. It's a big blur. You know, at Boston City Hospital, much more so than any other place in that era, there was nobody to help you on the wards. Terribly understaffed. Even when I took rotations as a Harvard student through the Harvard service at Boston City, I knew that we worked much harder there than any other place. Other places, you say, order a CBC, complete blood count, and somewhere this would get translated to a nursing order. It would go to the lab, and they'd send a technician, get to the bedside, and 2 hours later you might have a result delivered by hand or through a vacuum transit tube through the hospital. Now, at Boston City Hospital, you have to go find a needle, find a blood tube, find a requisition page, find someone to help you hold the patient while you draw the blood, or, you know, everything is on your own, and find a stretcher, it was really primitive because there wasn't much of anything. And then when you draw the blood, we had to go open up the lab. We each had keys to the lab, open it up and pipette the sample this way and put it on the counter and separate it out with a diluent and all kinds of things. We had to count blood cells. We did the counting ourselves. You just don't sit it. There was no automated labs and not enough budget to allow anybody else to do the lab work that we did ourselves.
And was it a city, county operated?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was the Boston Hospital Authority or something, I don't remember. But it had been for years, and it had taken care of poor people. It had been an almshouse before, and ancient. The BU service was mainly in a building that did not have alternating current. So it had dim lights that ran on direct current, and we couldn't plug in an EKG machine. You know, we had to run a wire to another building to power the EKG machine. In one of the Harvard service wards, the Peabody building was an even older building. They didn't have it either. They had 40-bed wards with a wood stove in the middle. And on that service, the interns were required to bring in wood, to go find wood for the stove in the winter. That's part of their job, bring in wood. It was nothing like the Mass General or the Boston or the Beth Israel. It was pretty elegant, you know. But I put up with that and did 2 years of internship, 1 year internship, then what they call residency year 1. Now they've collapsed the terms. They're all just postgraduate year 1, which we used to call internship, then postgraduate year 2, which we called a junior residency, then the next, and so forth. But now they're all the same. So I stayed through junior residency, 2 years at Boston City Hospital. A terrible blur, because I was just busy doing my own lab work, stealing stretchers where I could find a stretcher. If I needed to get somebody an x-ray, I also needed to find a stretcher. I also needed to load them on the stretcher. I also needed to push it down into the tunnels underneath this campus up to the x-ray suite. It was rough. Never any sleep. We were routinely, for most of the sub-rotations within that internship or residency, we would be on duty basically 6 days a week, and that included all night, every other night, basically, in addition. So it was nuts. I don't advocate that. It's not good. Saw a lot of misbehavior, a lot of failed care, attributable to that incredible pressure. But it's just the way it is. You just do that. Only poor people. But we did have a clinic that served poor people, and it was crowded and often confusing, but it was dedicated with some wonderful nurses who really cared about making sure that this patient whom they knew would get to the front of the list, and this patient would get the right wheelchair, and this patient did. And so it was pretty good. Now what? Well, it was in my internship year that I learned, did I discuss previously my connection? I was waiting for the CDC to send me its commission. Promised. Did I speak about the promise of the commission to join the Public Health Service?
We spoke about it before we went on tape last time,
Oh,
so we
so
need to cover all that
Yeah,
ground.
well, that's crucial. So lurking in the background of all this adventure was, what am I going to do when I finish internship? And in the summer, my transition out of medical school, well, I just should say, my graduation from medical school included the choice by my classmates to give us a talk at our class day. Not like a valedictory, they didn't have that, but it was one of several talks given. They asked me to give one of the talks on class day about where have we been these 4 years, what have we done? And they said, talk about community activities, what you did. And so I did, and that's my first publication. I was published the next issue of the Harvard Medical Alumni Bulletin. No big deal, it's a small thing, but I gave a talk, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes about why I thought that my medical education was at its best out in the community. And I summarized going to Mississippi Freedom Summer before medical school and working in the tent cities in the South End and the pitifully small, understaffed student clinic in the Mission Hill housing project that we organized, getting to know people up close where they live and so forth.
And before you go on, can you talk a little bit about what was the work you were doing and who were you doing it alongside at the tent city and these other projects?
It's a good question because I don't want to fly out an impression that I was practicing medicine. First of all, I'm not entitled to practice medicine. Beyond that, I didn't. It was basically a matter of interpreting and assisting people who were totally afloat out in the wilderness, not knowing what to do with this lump. What do I do with this? My baby's had a fever now for 3 weeks. What is this? What's going on? And they didn't even have any reason to be confident that they could go to a doctor or would benefit from that. It was pretty primitive stuff. So we were doing basically field triage, sort out what somebody could help, and then finding someone who could help them. It was our way of interpreting the medical community for them. I think at that time we called it medical presence, but not medical care. We just wanted to assure them that somebody cared about them, and wow, I don't know what this is, but I think you should go tomorrow morning to this emergency room because they will have an idea what to do. And we were appreciated for that primitive level of service. That's what we did.
And you would do this sort of once a week, or
not even. I mean, we rotated our time there. None of us had, during the more intense periods, maybe once a month. You know, so I would say, hey, in the course of medical school, I might have only been a dozen times. You know, that I went there, but we organized it, and organizing it also meant talking to the neighbors, saying, can we have a little corner of this recreation room for our clinic right now? You know, can we do this? Can we do? Is it okay with you? Do we need anything other permission? You know, will you ask the city manager, the city's representative in this housing project, if it's okay for us? You know, whatever.
And
so,
was the clinic? Did it have like standard hours that like every Friday it's open?
Well, it did, but they weren't enshrined. You know, we did the best we could to make it possible. We didn't have easy access to publicity. Occasionally we could run off a couple of announcements on a mimeograph machine or something and hang them in the hallways at the housing project, but it wasn't much. And there might only be 7 or 8 or a dozen people who would show up in the evening, and then we have 3 medical students, and we just sit down and listen to their story and say, wow, this is interesting. Yeah, I think it's something you should worry about. I don't know what it is. I will try to learn more, but in the meantime, you need to think about this and go here and go there. That's basically what we did. So we had a few times an intern from Boston City Hospital, usually who cared about this kind of stuff, who would come to help us. And a few times that intern would write a prescription or two, but basically there was no really definitive medical practice. We were just exposing, we also wanted some kind of self-assurance that we could talk to patients and be responsive to their concerns, which is not part of what you learn. So that was the answer.
And if you can, how would you describe sort of the demographics of the population?
Oh, in the tent city, there was a great majority black and a few other non-black Caribbean immigrants, Puerto Ricans mostly. And in the Mission Hill housing project, almost entirely black and a few very decultured white people, but they knew it was the black project. There are very poor white people elsewhere in Boston, but as a convenient spot in between the three medical schools that were collaborating, Mission Hill, a very black project, was the one we chose to do it in.
Because was Boston, like a lot of other older cities, particularly in the Northeast and sort of Midwest, had ethnic enclaves still at that point?
This was not the same kind of ethnic enclave of old South Boston, which was known to be, it's different from the South End. Southeast, South Boston was very Irish because they settled there in small apartments. Mission Hill was a city funded, like Cabrini Green in Chicago, or it was a very unpleasant, very crowded, very poorly run, rather dirty place meant to just house blacks with very little prospect for employment. And that was mainly also who was in the tent cities, likewise.
And during this period, I know you're extremely busy just keeping up with your professional life, but are you finding time for recreation? What does that recreation look like? Are you reading any papers at this time?
Not much. I mean, I tried.
Like Boston had an underground newspaper, if not several.
I don't recall that it did in that period. I think it did. And it was mostly in Cambridge. And I lived in Boston while I was married to Felicia. And then in the middle of internship, when the marriage dissolved, I found a very small apartment in downtown Cambridge, not near Harvard, but sort of a place where I could just zip across the Mass Avenue Bridge and be at Boston City Hospital in 25 minutes on my bike, and that was do it. I can't recall recreation. I mean, dated a little bit, rare.
I'm not finding time to go to a concert or a movie or a hike.
No.
Yeah.
I think I had a bike and I enjoyed riding it. I think I remember riding out to Fresh Pond, which is a few miles away from Harvard Square, and taking the bike path around Fresh Pond and getting back to my apartment. That was about it. So the issue was, where am I going to go when the draft comes after me? And I had applied to the CDC in medical school, I guess I didn't mention, or I barely mentioned, that I had taken a class in epidemiology, which I understood was looking quantitatively at how do you count up the people who have the disease and evaluate that, and where does that come from? How come these people have more diseases than this people? Is it just this age? Is it just this sex? Is it the fact that they're immigrants? What, and that sort of study.
And you would have been exposed to that as an undergraduate through
Well, not
some select introduction. Who was there was a
no. As an undergraduate, I had only benefited from the actuarial science exposure I had before I came to college. I was thinking then about numbers in the population. Epidemi, I mean, epidemos, upon the people. How do you take a disease rather than dissecting it from below? Where's the enzyme? Where's the antigen of this particular bacterium? The other way around. Start up in the population. Who has this disease? Can you learn from that? Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking of the introduction that was made to you of a renowned physician who was in the hospital recovering from like a knee replacement.
Oh, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That was the chronic disease epidemiology, but I was in medical school by then.
Oh, okay.
And that's where I disconnected my, yes. So at the beginning of the clinical rotations, just to recap where I had gone, diverted you last session. At the beginning of the clinical rotation, my first rotation in medical school, it's the beginning of third year, was at the Mass General in pediatrics. I thought pediatrics might be where I wanted to go. Prevention, that's a good idea, go there. But it was very mean and nasty, and I did not have a good time, and I complained to my mentor, Bernard Lown, that maybe I need to drop out of medical school. This is not satisfying, and in fact, it makes me angry, and I don't want to do this. He said, I understand. It's not an unreasonable thought. He said, but have you thought about epidemiology? Basically, he said, maybe that will be interesting to you. I know someone you should meet. And that's how I got to meet Jeremiah Stamler. So by then I was halfway through medical school. And I was in the hospital environment, but I got this lunch hour privilege of sitting in Jerry Stamler's hospital room while he was in Lake Traction, and he was lecturing me about why you need to look at the big numbers and study it that way. So anyway, I was into epidemiology. I also took, as part of my fourth year, an epidemiology class that was an elective at Harvard, taught by someone who had been through the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. And then it was called the National CDC, National Communicable Diseases Center. It's changed. Same doormat, still says CDC, but it's now no longer the Communicable Disease Center. But Jerry Stamler made it clear that we can use these same ways of looking at this movement of syphilis or of polio through the community, communicable diseases. We can look at the same things about heart disease and cancer, chronic diseases. He made it sound good. So I took this epidemiology class. I liked it, and my instructor, and who had been to the CDC for part of his draft exempt preparation, urged me to apply, and I already said, this is great, I'm going to do that. And I applied in medical school, had an interview at CDC, which was mutually wonderful. I mean, they said, we love you. Yeah, that's what we wanted. That's what we want. We want someone like you. Will you agree to serve? The way we do it is we give you a commission as soon as you say yes. And then you are because it's a commission in the uniformed service, the U.S. Public Health Service, not the Army, not the Navy, it's the but because you have a commission, you're exempt from the draft. That is your draft equivalent. It's like the Berry Plan, but we don't call it that. You'll be protected for 2 years of postgraduate training, internship, and PGY, well, first year junior residency. And then we take you, and you come to Atlanta or wherever we send you, and you'll do 2 years with us, and then we send you. That will be discharging your national service. and then you return to your training and become a really hotshot physician, and wherever you practice, you will know how to be epidemiologically curious. That's what we want. We're seeding doctors with this insight out in the world. It's called, that program is called the EIS, Epidemic Intelligence Service. Peculiar oxymoron right there. It got the name, it was founded in 1950 or 50, I believe, here in Atlanta at CDC by very astute bureaucrats who said, we'll never get it through the Congress, we want funding for this program. The CDC had just become a branch of the Public Health Service the year or two before that. In Atlanta, because here's where the National Malaria Control Program was, going back to the 20s or 30s, and they took that and made it into Communicable Disease Center. And now we want to really build the National Communicable Disease Center with training for future epidemiologists. They called it the Epidemic Intelligence Service because it would sound military. And
They succeeded.
and it did, and I could do that. It was okay. And so came to Atlanta, met the then chiefs of the service, a great interview. When I got back to Boston, they already had telegraphed me, we definitely want you, please send us a telegram that you'll accept, and we'll start the paperwork for your commissioning. So I didn't have to worry about going to Canada. I got this promise from the CDC, and the rest is legal history because the commission didn't come. The CDC told me in very painful conversations on the phone, by mail, back and forth, we don't understand. This has never happened before. We are sure the paperwork was received in Bethesda, which is where the headquarters of the Public Health Service was. And they can't explain why your commission isn't coming through either, but something's not right. And I was in limbo, beginning to think, ooh, it could be political. Of course it was, but I had no evidence of that, except that this had never happened before. I requested an appointment. This is during my divorce proceedings, during my internship year. My peers at Boston City covered me for 26 hours or something like that, so I could fly to Washington and meet personally with the Undersecretary of Health, Education, and Welfare at his office at 330 Independence Avenue in downtown Washington. He said, Dr. Kahn, I've got 10 minutes for you. That's all I have. He said, I've got your file on my desk. Did I tell you this story before?
Not on tape.
Okay. He said, he points to a file this thick. He said, I know what's in that file. You know what's in that file. I'm telling you now, don't make waves, because you're going to be sorry if you do. But that's all he would say. I said, is this political? I have no comment. Okay. So what's going on here? You know, I don't have a commission. It did not come. I'm in my getting into internship. At the end of that, they're going to draft me. And fortunately, that was the fall of the summer, basically, or the early fall of 1968. I had graduated from medical school. I was in the middle of my internship, going through a divorce, and an internship was very grueling. In November, second week in November, I received a letter from the Commission Personnel Operations Division. Mind you, this is November 1968. The historians among you will know that that was when Richard Nixon was just elected president. Only after that election was determined, second week of November, did they write the letter to me saying, we have reviewed your file and determined you are unfit to hold a commission in the U.S. Public Health Service. This terminates our correspondence. Boom. Okay, so they were waiting until they found out who the next president was. And when it was Richard Nixon, they did it. They sent me that letter. So I called my lawyers, and they said, is it political? I said, I think so, but what's the evidence? And I said, well, if they have no evidence, they can just say we didn't choose you. That's it. But if you can find out it's political, we have a civil liberties case here. Okay?
And how did you find these lawyers?
I had already made contact with them through other relations like the Medical Resistance Union, and we were looking for people that were covering us, saying, are we crazy? Are we putting our necks on the block? And this was through the, I had written to the American Civil Liberties Union saying, I think there's an issue here of political interference with this process. Will you help? And they basically said, we don't know, probably not. It's not, they've been less than sterling. But I did go to the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, which was a break-off from the ACLU, over the important distinction that the ACLU was saying in the 1950s, we will not defend communists. And this became a marker of actually not defending other people too, who might be communists. And so you can understand that this was a place where I might go. And I went there and they called me in for an interview and said, well, this is interesting and we would like to help, but keep in touch. If you can come up with evidence that it's political, we'll help you. And they did. So 6 months later, 4 months later, in March of '69, I was scared and I was starting to ask around, what am I going to do? And I'm being an intern and being a newly divorced man and not having recreational time. What am I going to do? I got this letter at home from, I had already made calls to the dean at Harvard who got back to me and said, you're a great candidate for the Epidemic Intelligence Service. I'll support you. What do you want me to do? Write a letter. He did. And the chief of medicine at the BU Medical Service said, I can't imagine a better candidate for this service. You're motivated. You go out in the community. Write me a letter. And he did. And they were in the file. I'm told. I didn't actually see them. I saw their letters. They sent me copies of their letter. So I contacted my senators, and Ted Kennedy wrote me a letter saying, I'll take care of it. Never heard from him again. I can't comment on what happened. I'm sure he's a busy man. He was a busy man. And I didn't expect to hear from Edward W. Brooke, my other senator, the Republican senator from Massachusetts, but who was also black. He's blacker than me by a little bit. And was former Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts and the first black in the Senate since Reconstruction. And I didn't hear from him until March. This letter, which was the first Xerox any of us had seen in my family, it said, this is a Xerox across the top. You know, it was a Xerox of his typewritten letter to his friend, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Robert Finch. Dear Robert, his friend. They're all Republicans. Edward Brooke and Bob Finch and Richard Nixon. Bob, he said, I want to review for you the concerns of my constituent, Dr. Henry Kahn. He obviously had taken some time. He outlined in this closely written, single-space, 3-page letter. Dr. Kahn did this, Dr. Kahn did this, and then his commission didn't come. So I sent an aide over to the Commission Personnel Operations Division to find out what was in Dr. Kahn's file that made him unfit to serve. And the aide showed me was shown two things. Brooke himself wasn't there, the aide was there. That's in Brooke writing. One, the file, which I had already seen physically. You know I didn't send them that much stuff. The file had a photo of Dr. Kahn, undated, but it says it's recognizable as Boston Common, and he's holding a sign, and it says, "End the war in Vietnam." Item number one. No allegations of arrest, of conviction, or indictment, nothing, just he's holding a sign on Boston Common. And number two, they found my signature on a letter soliciting money for a memorial, to build a memorial to the late Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who had died in summer of 1963 when I was an undergraduate. He died the day of the Great March on Washington. Great irony, great father of American sociology, the author of The Philadelphia Negro and The Souls of Black Folks, and professor later in his earlier life, at Atlanta University, which is now, he had a house for 12 years right down the block from here, where he was a very revered professor in Atlanta. But he had died, and among his many distinctions was that he was the first black to get a PhD from Harvard in the 1890s. It was his second PhD. He got into Harvard only after he first got a PhD from Berlin in Germany. Then he came back to the States and Harvard took him in and he got a Harvard PhD. Anyway, remarkable man, very progressive, active socialist who in his final years declared himself to be a communist. He said there was no hope for anything improving with race relations in the USA without a socialist, and we need to take over the society. Those are his final years. He died at age 93 in Ghana, living in Ghana. But he died, and among others, we need a memorial to Du Bois on the campus. There aren't any blacks memorialized at Harvard. This was this time. Anyway, so they showed this letter to Boston. The aides showed the letter to Brooke, who said, Bob, he said, I have also signed letters raising money for a memorial to the late Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a native of Massachusetts. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. No question. Edward Brooke knew who Du Bois was and knew his works. I mean, he was a very educated black man, a liberal Republican. And that was the clincher. So we have now on the record from the U.S. Senator that I was denied a commission because I protested the war in Vietnam and I supported a memorial to Dr. Du Bois. So I called Leonard Boudin, who was the lawyer assigned to me in New York City, who was a renowned civil liberties authority on these kind of things. Wonderful guy. And he said, this is it, we're going to go, come. I want to take your case. I want you to work out details with Al Rosenberg, I think that was his name. Rosenberg, yeah, I think it's Al Rosenberg. I may be forgetting his first name, but who's an occasional collaborator with me in Boston, because we're going to have to file the case in the Eastern District of Massachusetts Federal Court, because that's where you live, and that's where you get this correspondence. I will be your lawyer of record, and I want Mr. Rosenberg to be on the case so he can move in and out quickly, delivering papers that need to be. He's very reliable. Rosenberg also became my divorce attorney at that point, but that's fine. It was simple, clean, very nice. Come down, let's have a talk when you can get to New York, and we'll go through a few details, and I want to make sure I got the details right. Anyway, he just moved beautifully and filed a suit in the U.S. Federal Court. It's called Kahn versus Secretary of HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. And among the co-defendants named in the suit was the Surgeon General of the United States, the Director of the Selective Service System, so that they could, as a named defendant, they could have the judge order him to not draft me during this, and beautifully designed case. And we entered the federal court in the spring of '69. Leonard came up from New York to do the original filing and stood before the judge, made the case. The judge said, I heard him. That's one of the 2 times I was in the courtroom. I mean, the rest of it happened over my head, behind my back. These things, but I heard the judge say, you mean this young man is suing the secretary, a cabinet level secretary, because he doesn't like what he thought? Leonard said, yes, Your Honor, that's what he is suing the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. I said, well, he said, on its face, it has very little chance of success, but okay, we'll accept the case. We're gonna move forward. And Leonard Boudin, Boudin, my attorney, nicely said, the first thing we need is to just find out what's in Dr. Kahn's record. That's reasonable. So we moved to ask you to order them to open the record so we can see it. The judge said that's a reasonable thing to do. Republican appointee judge from I don't know when. Okay, and anyway, the government stonewalled. No, we're not showing the record. It's a national security issue. It does not need to be revealed. And they stonewalled, and then Boudin said, well, we'll make a compromise. We will allow in-camera examination. That is to say, we won't even see what's in it. We'll just ask the government to deliver the record to you, Judge, and we'll trust you to look at the record yourself. And I won't. Dr. Kahn and his staff, his attorneys, will not look at the record. You decide if our allegations are true. Is this a political issue? The judge thought that was reasonable. He ordered them to deliver Dr. Kahn's folder in camera in his chambers. Okay? The government refused to do it. Stonewall. We think this is a dangerous precedent. We don't want to go there. It's a security issue. It cannot be revealed. So, wrangling back and forth for 2 years. And then the judge, well, during that time I had to decide what was I going to do.
Yeah.
So I was protected against the draft. I got a draft notice, and we never even had to summon the director of selective service because actually I had earlier in my career, in my high school career, when I signed up for a draft card, I had submitted a request to come and explain my conscientious objection to war. And they never, I sent it with a certified letter. We're talking, I was like 18 years old. That was not high school, it was the first year of college, but I sent it certified, so I had a certified receipt that they had gotten my letter. Copy of the letter, which said, I would like to discuss with you my claim to be a conscientious objector, and they never responded to me. So anyway, I was drafted, and we used that letter as evidence that they couldn't draft me until they'd invited me in to discuss my conscientious objection status, and the draft board never got around to it. They just didn't do it. So that held the draft off. But I started applying for residencies in Canada, and it was clumsy. My heart wasn't in it. I didn't especially want to go. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I also applied for another year of residency, saying, well, I've got a little cover here. I had finished 2 years of training at Boston City Hospital. Through my connections with the student health organizations, I was in a large correspondence with over 30 other young doctors who wanted to take over the system and make it right. And we conspired during that time by mail to all apply to one hospital in the city of New York where we would show up simultaneously and prove that we could make a difference. We'd run the hospital right. So we all applied for what would be postgraduate training year 3. At least for me that was the case. For some of them it was already 4. Or some of them was beginning, but we would apply to Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx. New York City has had 19 city hospitals. It's not just Bellevue, not just Kings County. Those are the 2 big ones, but 19 city hospitals. The smallest one of which was Lincoln, very small, in the South Bronx, serving a catchment area of about 400,000 people. Of course, they're in the city of New York. They could go elsewhere, but their neighborhood was Lincoln Hospital. And these were mostly Puerto Ricans, a small number of blacks. And the hospital was dreadful. It was decrepit, it was small and dirty and unheated, and it was not well, it was heated, but inadequately heated. There was lead paint on the walls. That's a whole other story. That's in this book, White Coat, Clenched Fist, about how all these medical students got together and said, we're going to go to Lincoln Hospital. And we all got into the residency there, 37 of us, okay, at one time. And we chose to do it in pediatrics, because the majority of this radical group leaned to pediatrics and had already done their first year's training in pediatrics. I was one of the exceptions in internal medicine. I said, I'll do pediatrics this year. I'm ready. I don't mind. I want to be part of this. It means something to me. Lincoln Hospital had never before had a year in which they had a house officer. That's what we call interns and residents. Never had more than one trained in the United States. They were virtually all residents from training elsewhere. A lot of West Africans, a lot of Filipinos, Filipinas, Indians, Pakistanis, and so forth.
Even in the late 60s.
And so we were applying 37 students, all of whom were from elite U.S. medical schools with good records. And we all applied. They couldn't compute what is going on. And we all got in. Boom. It's a very long, exciting story with definitely no vacation time beyond one or two tiny exceptions. And we all wound up there and became the Lincoln Collective. Or some say the Lincoln Pediatric Collective. We called ourselves the Lincoln Collective because we did include a few people in internal medicine, one psychiatrist and so forth. But basically, it was the Lincoln Collective of these disaffected medical students. We included some nurses in our collective structure, and more importantly, we invited in the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords Party to join us for weekly meetings to discuss how we're going to make this hospital a better place. And it's a very long and complex.
And were the Panthers and the Young Lords receptive?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some of those participants there are people whose names you might recognize. Actually, they become outspoken advocates for the Puerto Rican movement and so forth. But they were very young at the time, so were we. We were all in our 20s. Okay, and so while I was still waiting in court, I was actually doing my third year of postgraduate training, this time in pediatrics, and they called me a first-year resident in pediatrics, which is in between. It basically would have been a second-year title, but I was eligible for third-year title, but I had never been a pediatrician before, so it was all very collective and balanced, non-hierarchical. The chief residents were wonderful. They would come in and draw blood in the middle of the night, just like anybody else. You know, we all spent a lot of time going to political meetings. And in this final, as I knew I was going to be going to Lincoln, I was still finishing my junior residency year at Boston City. I should mention, it's very important to me, that I had been divorced. I'd been out barely in the dating scene at all, but living singly. And I discovered that Mickey Gilmore, who had been my lover and partner as undergraduates, and we had agreed to break up at the end of college, that she was living in Cambridge, about 10 blocks from where I had an apartment. I didn't even know that when I got that apartment, but she had also moved into that area, living alone. That story is very romantic and pleasing, and we're still married today, but we basically got back together, became a couple again slowly, delicately, and talked about what will we do. If I moved to New York, would she come with me? And we stretched out the discussion for quite a while. Mickey was not willing to do it without a clear commitment from me. A few years earlier, both of us said we're not ready, but now she wanted a commitment, and I was unsure. And that summer, she and a group of her teaching colleagues who had been working on child education for the sciences went to develop, carefully prepared to go to Cuba and volunteer to do teacher training seminars for elementary students to learn science in Cuba. She was a Spanish major, and she taught the group a great deal of Spanish, and none of them had been to Cuba before, but they were doing this. And so when I got to the end of junior residency, Mickey was on her way to Cuba for 2 months, I think it was. The whole summer, basically. And I was moving.
And is this 69 or 70?
This is 70. Oh, 69.
Okay.
And end of 69. Wait a second. 60. No, 70. And it's the summer of 1970. I was moving from Boston City Hospital to Lincoln Hospital in New York. I got an apartment in New York City. Mickey was going to Cuba for the summer, but had preserved her apartment in Boston. I missed her badly. I was very stressed out in my Lincoln Hospital experience, but very energized because now I was working with students and peers that I really liked and could share value system with. And basically, I couldn't communicate with Mickey. And so it was a big unknown, and I was in this world afloat by myself. But I survived the Lincoln collective experience. I still have many close friends from that period. And when Mickey came back, I was ready for a commitment. So we agreed at the end of the summer that we would get married, and she would move to New York, and she did. We married in the beginning of October. That was my one brief vacation period the Lincoln Collective comrades covered for me for a long weekend, so Mickey and I could get married. And we went up to Cape Cod and got married on the dunes, where a friend of ours had a family cottage, and it was lovely. That was it, 48 hours, and we were back in this way. And Mickey came to New York to have a very stressful job as an open classroom consultant for the New York City elementary schools, underprivileged elementary schools. So she was up here in this similar kind of struggles, but in the school system, and I was in the hospital system. But that year at Lincoln was tumultuous. I don't have enough time to tell you every struggle, every dramatic patient, every conflict that we dealt with. Early in that Lincoln year, the state police came into the hospital with weapons and took it over and just said, "You can't do this. The mayor will not allow you to do this to this hospital."
Yeah, I was going to ask,
when
the hospital administration finally is able to discern what's actually going on when you all arrive.
They called the state police. And the state police came in and surrounded the hospital. I remember it well. It's outlined in the book, but I was asleep in the residence call room, and I hear sirens and banging and knocking of batons, and the hospital was surrounded, and we were all stoutly disciplined, but we stood our ground, and the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords Party brought in community members to surround the hospital around the police and say, "This is our hospital. We wanted to move in this direction." And so many of the administrators disappeared. They couldn't handle it, and our chief...
They just left.
Our chief of pediatrics was outraged because he was a fairly liberal, well-educated Frenchman, a Jew. The hospital was, I say that because the hospital was associated academically with Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which was a couple miles away, and had a liberal reputation, but Albert Einstein didn't lavish resources on this hospital. It had its own much preferred New York City hospital called Jacobi Hospital in the North Bronx, where they put their resources, their research labs, all that stuff. And occasionally one of the Albert Einstein professors would come down to Lincoln to hang out for a few hours, and that was it. So the professor of pediatrics at Einstein considered himself a gift to the Puerto Rican community. He's a very arrogant old professor model, Professor Einhorn. I am the professor. And his credentials, which not zero. I mean, he had been a fighter in the French resistance against the Nazis. He had been well trained in Paris as a pediatrician and a newborn disease specialist. But he could not tolerate. He was blindsided. He knew he thought it was because he's so attractive as a teacher that he suddenly got 30-something residents on his service from Harvard and Yale and Chicago. And that wasn't what came for him. And he had basically a break. He had to disappear. And he accused us of anti-Semitism. Half of us were Jewish, but he accused us of anti-Semitism because why else would you not like me? You know, but he actually was a model of the 19th century professor. My first week at Lincoln, this was one of the harsher things that I endured. My very first week was in the neonatal intensive care unit. I had worked in intensive care units for old people, and here every one of my patients was this big, right? I was terrified. I mean, I was not stupid. I had read and I knew some basics. And there were some wonderful nurses there who knew what they were doing and could walk me through the steps and said, but dude, a sick baby this size, you know, it was just, it was held in my hand, like, I can't, how am I going? Oh no, that was before she actually moved down to be with me. She was just commiserating by phone in Boston. You know, this must be terrible, what it, and Einhorn would come in and say, is that baby? His French accent. Is that baby? That's hypothyroid. You should have recognized that. I said, I'm sorry, Professor Einhorn. I guess I don't know what to look for in a hypothyroid baby. He said, I tell you, it's hypothyroid. I am the professor. When I look at that baby, it is hypothyroid, and we need to do the da-da-da-da. Well, he should have known, and he turned out he was wrong, but even if he was right, he was not teaching me anything, you know. He was just the authority. And I would look around at the other residents, some of whom were from the Philippines and some were from Nigeria, and so what do I do now? You know, what? Just tell them what you think. You don't know how it is. And he refused to explain it to me. When I tell you it looks like, that's what it looks like, you know. We had lots of those examples, and all of this was in the front page of the New York Times for a number of days intermittently through that period because it was unknown to have first this takeover of the hospital and then chief of service accusing his own staff of anti-Semitism against him, which was really dishonest and nasty. It was way off the point. But he thought that would gain him points at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which was a branch of Yeshiva University. It had never occurred to us that we were anti-Semitic or that was relevant here. At any point, it was not relevant at all. But anyway, his time came and went. We got to choose our next chief of service.
And did the collective at some point make a declaration, we're taking over, we're calling the shots? Or?
Yes, but it wasn't publicly advertised in that way. But we did act as if we were, and we internally said, we don't agree with Einstein, we'll do it with Einstein's ignoring us, and we don't agree with Einhorn's, the professor's style of leadership, so we'll just do it ourselves. We get our own education programs. And our own.
But there wasn't like a handwritten declaration delivered?
I don't recall that, but we went to a lot of meetings. We talked in the meetings as if we were going to just take it over, and we denied it. And I'm sure the Young Lords and the Black Panthers shared that language. Quite an experience. So Meanwhile, my court case was going on. I still hadn't won anything. But it wasn't, I should tell you that in May, now I was a married man, exhausted, but still working at Lincoln, still not knowing what I'm going to do. Again, starting to look at Canadian options. Finally, in May of '71, which is right 1 month before the end of my residency year at Lincoln, we ended the end of June, and this was the middle of May, I get a phone call from the lawyer, Leonard Boudin. He said, "Congratulations, we've won." And so Judge Julian had issued a summary judgment. He said, "I'm tired of dealing," he used very unusual language. Basically, "I'm fed up with the federal government stonewalling. This is unprecedented. They have no right to withhold information, deny me access to the record. I am declaring hereby, by summary judgment, that everything Dr. Kahn says is correct and everything the government says is false. And I issue a summary judgment. The government must hereby," he's addressing the defendants, Secretary of HEW and the Surgeon General of the United States, "the defendants must immediately issue a commission to Dr. Kahn so that he can enter the service at the CDC. And number two, I hereby also find that they are obligated at this point forward to cease and desist from investigating Dr. Kahn's political beliefs and associations." Pretty nice judgment, summary judgment. Woo!
And the government didn't appeal.
They did not appeal, not yet. That was 50 years ago. Almost 48 years ago, something like that. So they did not appeal, and I won my case. But the commission didn't come. Month after month. And Leonard Boudin said, "Every month, send them a certified letter to the Surgeon General of the United States, to the Secretary of HEW, say, here is my phone number, here is my address, here is where you can reach me. Well, I'm waiting for my commission." It comes through after 11 months. Nothing came. We moved in federal court to jail the Secretary of HEW for contempt of court. And my commission arrived next week. Okay, so they came around. different. By then, Nixon was gone. Different. I think he was gone by then. Well, maybe not. I don't really remember. It was close. He was in disrepute. But no, he wasn't gone. Of course not. He still had another term to go. I got confused. Mm-hmm. But so I won the case, and 11 months later, finally got the commission. But that 11 months, I was in limbo. So I got a job in New York City. I said, "I've had enough residency for now. I'll take a job as an internist."
So you had left Lincoln?
I left Lincoln after 1 year.
And did the collective stay on?
Yes,
or?
Well, not everybody. You know, this is by nature an evolving, rotating crew. But they did. They called it the Lincoln Collective for about 4 or 5 more years, and there's still 1 or 2 people who are at Lincoln. Lincoln has moved to, finally got a new building. We might have actually highlighted the inadequacy. That building was so old that when, what's the name of the movie director who did The Godfather? I've forgotten this. When he was doing The Godfather, he needed a movie set that would have looked like a hospital that was old in the 1930s. Remember when Don Corleone was stabbed and injured, and they had to rush into a hospital in the middle of the night, and the ambulance is riding up this old ramp into a rickety old hospital. That was Lincoln Hospital. In fact, we had 2 or 3 days when we couldn't go in that door because they were filming a movie there that became The Godfather, #1. So it was chosen as the site for an old hospital in the 1930s, and I was there in the 1970, 71. right? And I never saw Marlon Brando. I was too busy taking care of babies, but, you know, he was being filmed right there in the hospital, and we weren't allowed to go in that entrance while the movie cameras were there. Lincoln Hospital was founded after the Civil War as, not as a hospital, there were no hospitals back then. It was founded as the Lincoln Home for Worthy Colored People. It was meant as an almshouse for impoverished blacks, and then it became a hospital. And it became the Lincoln Home for Worthy Colored People. And then the neighborhood became Puerto Rican instead of black, but mostly. But anyway, there's quite a year. So what did I do? I went and got a job with the Midwest Side Neighborhood Health Programs on the edge of Harlem, the west end of Harlem, West 100th Street in New York. Nikki and I had an apartment on West 97th Street, so I could walk to work and stepping over bodies on Amsterdam Avenue, Columbus Avenue, and then I was there in the clinic. And I actually got to I taught myself how to do primary care in an OEO-sponsored clinic, Office of Economic Opportunity. That was the name of the plan. And I was basically on the edge of Harlem, a general internist meeting new people and giving them an appointment to come back. Anyway, so I taught myself to be a general internist, and that was a rewarding year, much more relaxing during that time. I studied up my boards, studied up a lot of internal medicine that I might have neglected or not yet learned, and took my board exam in internal medicine and passed. So they gave me credit for the pediatric year as if it was just some specialty year. Most often you do 2 years in general internal medicine, then you do 1 or 2 or 3 years of being a cardiologist or a gastroenterologist. And I argued, I really want to do general internal medicine. I want to focus on prevention. I think I should get just as much credit for a pediatric year as I would for a kidney disease year or something. And they accepted the argument. It said, but you got to pass your exams. So I took my board exams in internal medicine, and I passed the first time. Very interesting, but off the point of this interview, I was in the last cohort that took a board certification exam in internal medicine where I actually had to see a patient and demonstrate my stuff before 2 real patients and 2 real professors who would want to see, did I really know what I was looking at? Ever since then, that's 1972, ever since 72, board certification in internal medicine is just paper exams, or paper and television images. But in the very last cohort, they sent me a notice. They saying, we've assigned you to Birmingham, Alabama. We pick a spot where you've never studied and you've never been a doctor. And you don't know anybody. In Birmingham, and you have to show up at 7:30 in the morning at this hospital, and you'll meet the evaluators, and they will have designated 2 patients for you to see, and then they will interrogate you. What do you know about me? What have you learned?
So that's how the exam took place?
Yeah. Well, I had to first pass the paper part.
Mm-hmm.
I got past that, then you go for the in-person exam.
And did they pay your airfare? Like you had to come up with?
Yeah. With that, by then I'm a rich man. I've already, I've gotten out of residency already. That is the way it worked. So I flew there and stayed in a motel and went in, and it was a rough day. I mean, I already had passed the paper part, so this was, my reputation was on the line. And a lot of the first time failures in this are very high. But people get a chance to do it again and again and again, but it wasn't clear what was going to happen since we knew this style of exam was coming to an end. The first patient, the patients were really sick, but they'd been patients before in this kind of exercise. They do not mention this word, do not say what you have, just answer the questions. The young doctor will ask you a bunch of questions and just don't say that. We know you know what you have, but don't say it. The first one was a complicated cardiac patient. That was clear, but there was very confusing murmurs and other history findings, and I got this, long story, I mean, I got that one. I had, by good happenstance, in the previous few days, I had actually read up Eisenmenger's complex. It's the name of this unusual combination of congenital heart diseases. And I got it right. And I named it and nailed it. And when they said, would you like to see an x-ray? Yes, sir, I'd like to see the x-ray. Okay, that's the x-ray. Now, oh, well, yeah, I see the little blunting of this artery over there. You know, I got it. But I was... I'm glad
Great luck in preparation.
Yeah, I prepped. The other one, I had no clue what was going on. I knew that it was something with joints and bad skin, and it was. And they said, "Okay, what do you think she has?" I said, "Sir, I really don't know." And the long story short, I waffled, and they said, "It looks sort of like lupus, but it's not lupus because." Would you like to see an x-ray? Would you like? Well, yeah, we got through all of that. I still said, I still don't know what it is. It looks sort of like lupus, but it looks like rheumatoid arthritis, but it's not rheumatoid arthritis because it hasn't. At this point, I don't know if I could get the arguments right any longer, but I did not know what she had. And one guy was the bad cop, and one guy was the good cop, and they came with questions at me different. I said, well, I looked at the erosion of the joint here in the second metacarpal, and I don't know what I do. I don't know. So why don't you commit yourself? I said, I can't. I just, let's see. I told you as much as I know. And okay, that'll end the interview. Thank you very much. And then in the hallway, one of the guys said to me, the two professors, have you ever heard of overlap syndrome? I said, no, sir, I haven't. He said, well, when you get back to New York, look it up. Okay, it turns out there was named, and I had not studied this and seen it in the previous year's literature, overlap syndrome, some case that's sort of in between lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. And, and I had never heard of it, and it was not known to me, but I got everything. I got it. I established that I wasn't a fool, you know. And indeed, I passed the board. So that was a pleasant surprise. Only one of the guys would even give me a hint at the end when I went out the door. You know, when you get back to New York, look up overlap syndrome. Yeah, right. So I got that one right too. Only I didn't know what to call it. I knew how to spell Eisenmenger's complex, but so anyway, now I'm a board certified internist. I'm waiting for my commission to come. And it finally does come. No, it had come. No, I had won the case in May of '70, but the commission didn't come till 11 months later. That was April of '71. And I'm working in Harlem, in the clinic in Harlem. And I'm getting that somehow wrong, because I expected my commission to come, and it didn't come, but I took leave from my job earlier than that, in the Harlem job, because I said, I'm protected against civil liberties intrusion, and I'm still waiting for my commission. I think I am obligated ethically to use this protection to do something that's political, since they're prohibited by the judge's order from investigating my political beliefs and association. What can I do? So I took leave from my job in Harlem and raised money in New York City to open a coffee house in San Antonio, Texas, for physicians who were being drafted. Well, that's not it, actually. It's a different thing.
In this one?
Oh, maybe, no, it's not there. No, this is the civil rights movement in Mississippi.
I think there's a mention.
Well, maybe
I read something.
Maybe it mentions that I did that, but it doesn't detail
yeah.
it, because Yeah. So my idea was going there because my classmates from Harvard were now going through basic training as they were about to become generals or majors in the medical corps. But all physicians in the Army, and I think in the Air Force too, have to do their basic training in San Antonio. Either at Lackland Air Force Base or at Fort Sam Houston for the Army, Lackland Air Force Base for the Air Force. So I said, hey, there's going to be a lot of young doctors going through basic training there as they move on to head up the medical corps. I'm going to open a coffee house there and invite them to come talk about the war. Bring in speakers, bring in folk singers. And so I rented an apartment. I did this on my own. Well, with money and support from the donors in New York City.
But not through an established organization or...
No.
Or a network of GI coffee houses?
Well, I mean, I was in touch with them, but it was a relatively new idea, the GI coffee house. And I opened it, I bought an apartment right on the edge of Fort Sam Houston and found this variety of transient spaces where I could have a basement in the church here or that, or there, and open the coffee house. And dozens of doctors would come through at different times. They were a privileged group. They had some evenings off, on this. And so, I saw many of my classmates there in uniform, and I would just walk onto the base and say, hey, George, whatever. Let me talk to you about this. They knew what I was doing. It was not a surprise to them, but I met many others too. And doctors I'd known in New York City in practice who were young doctors who were coming in. Their buried plan exemption had gone out, and they were coming in. And I should tell you with great pride, about a year later, the New York Times published a letter from 50 physicians serving in Vietnam saying this is a terrible mistake. We object to what we're being asked to do. This is not appropriate. And on that list of the 50 physicians who signed, there was a whole bunch who'd come to my coffee houses in San Antonio.
And was this at all affiliated with the Medical Committee for Human Rights, or?
Not in any formal way. I mean, okay. I counted on some people I knew from MCHR, but they didn't. It was not an anti-war group until, well, it was in that era moving in that direction, but it really wasn't. But it was a similar circle of colleagues, friends. So.
Yeah, because Dittmer's in The Good Doctors does have I looked through the index and was reading the pages where you're mentioned, and
okay, so
one of the pages does mention
that I had
an action in Texas, and also mentions that two people, other people, like chartered a little plane and dropped flyers.
That was even earlier. This was Susan Schnall, who was the wife of one of the Lincoln Collective members. He was a guy who was doing internal medicine while I was doing pediatrics, but earlier, it's true, Susan Schnall had rented a plane while she was a lieutenant in the Navy and working in a naval hospital in the Bay Area of California, and I dropped flyers over San Francisco. Yes, but that was informal connections, similar people. So.
And so how long were you in Texas?
I don't know. I could probably figure it out, but it was a small number of months, maybe 2.
And did Mickey go with you?
No,
or?
She was working hard in the New York City school system, didn't have my flexibility. So I went on my own. I don't think it was more than 2 months. Susan Schnall came down and stayed in my apartment with her baby. She had a baby at that point, and spoke at the coffee house. But I mean, I was there for 2 months. She came and stayed for 3 days, something like that, just as a speaker, talking about her experience opposing the war while in uniform as a nurse lieutenant. And other people, a rather important major in the medical corps, from a long military family who had a change of heart and just said, I will not do this anymore. Came down, stayed with me for a while, and gave some wonderful talk. A West Point graduate. I said, it's that kind of stuff I was able to lean. he was not part of the Lincoln Collective. He came from a very different tradition, but we converged. He said, "You're right. I'm here to say, as a major in the Army being mustered out now, more power to you. Resist any way you can." He had been on General Patton's staff. So that was a good anecdote. But we haven't gotten to Atlanta yet. And I'm worried now that we're not going to get...
Did the coffee house persist?
No.
No.
Not that I know of. I doubt that it did. It was basically a fly-by-night operation. I had to, from one week to the next, had to find a different venue for it, And we did one neat action, which would certainly by definition not exist, just in action. I rented a big flatbed truck. I've never driven a big tractor trailer before. They let me do it. I rented a tractor trailer and rented a big amplifier and all kinds of stuff, and brought a whole bunch of displays and some singers and some dancers to a demonstration in front of the Alamo. Right, went to the Alamo saying we oppose the war, and they let me do it.
And you drove this big truck?
I drove the big truck, and I just can't imagine.
Without a commercial driver. So.
They let me rent it. Texas is not exactly a well-regulated state. So I really am mindful that we want to talk about the bird.
Yes.
But it's
do you want to take an apple break?
Yeah, I'll take an apple and...
yeah, then we'll get back to it.
I could bloviate around how I wound up here, but you got the story. The point is, I suddenly found myself actually with the commission, and it was only a few months shy of actually needing to start service in Atlanta. I got the commission just before the end of April, when they have the annual EIS convention in Atlanta of all the current and future and recently past epidemic officers coming together to decide what's in the year ahead and to give papers about what I learned, and what I learned about measles in Kentucky, or what I learned about polio in India, or that kind of stuff. So I got the commission just a few weeks before the end of April, when I should be arriving in order to prepare for the July 1 active duty. So why not take a break and then come back to how I came to Atlanta.
Yeah.
Just a few days warning that, hey, you just made it in time for the EIS meeting, which is essential to plan for your arrival in July, so you got to be here. You have to come to Atlanta and attend this meeting so we can assign you to whatever, the polio desk or the...
So you get a letter with a few days warning to come to this mandatory conference.
Right.
Wow.
Well, the commission had arrived, and then as a consequence, I called them and said, hey, I got the commission. Oh, great, we'll put you in the class for this July. Be here in April for a whole week.
Yeah.
Okay, so take a good break. There is things to be said about Atlanta.
Okay, so we're just coming back from a little break, and we, with much anticipation, are coming to Atlanta.
I hope so. So I guess that puts us in 72, when 11 months after the judge's decision, I got the commission, and that left me just a few days to say, oh, I can make it to the annual end of April meeting of the Epidemic Intelligence Service, because everybody comes together for a week and we share our new discoveries, we give papers, we criticize each other's work in a friendly way, usually. And then we plan for the next year. And in the case of the arriving new officers, of whom there were about 40 every year, I was privileged to be one of 40, now that I have my commission. And we would not only get to listen to the deliberations of the older folks, the more experienced officers talking about their assignments and what they've learned and what didn't work and what did work in their studies. But we also had to go through local interviews to decide what projects we each want to work on. You can't just do everything in epidemiology, and most of the CDC's work is either focused on a desk in a room at the headquarters in Atlanta which says, we do polio. We supervise the observations, the surveillance of polio around the world. Or being shipped out to a smaller epidemiology office in Nebraska, or Hawaii, or Florida, or the city of New York, or someplace where they will ask us to do whatever comes up, because we want you on the ground rather than doing everything in New York City. You'll do a few things in New York, whatever. So here I am, scheduled to arrive in Atlanta for good, July 1, but having to come first in April to negotiate, to learn the ropes and negotiate my position. I did have a commission, which protected me from draft.
And a uniform?
Well, that's an interesting story. I was about to enter the uniformed service, but when I arrived in July, I actually started getting a uniform allowance, so I could go buy a uniform. That's the way you get an allowance, and you go to the uniform store and you buy a uniform. I got the allowance. I never bought the uniform. I actually went 2 years on active duty plus 1 month more. I stayed on to introduce the work to the next class coming in. So I did 25 months of uniform duty, never bought a uniform.
So there
I forgot.
So rare occasions when you're required to wear the uniform.
I only borrowed a uniform once when I wanted to fly low price on an airplane. Back then you could do that by being in uniform and showing your card. I did have a commissioned officer's card. Anyway, so I'm scheduled to come into Atlanta. They pay for a hotel room across the street. The CDC at that time was one small building. Well, not small. It was 5 stories. Right across the street on Clifton Road, right across the street from where the New Point complex is on Clifton Road. But that's all there was to CDC, just one little 5-story building.
Right adjacent to Emory University.
Adjacent to Emory campus. The history is that Emory University, learning that CDC was going to expand in the 1950s, went through a negotiation on behalf of one of the Mr. Woodruffs, I don't know. He said, we heard this was coming and we'd like it to be on the edge of the Emory campus. This will be important to us. So he sold a few acres of land to the government for $1 or something like that, so that they would build it there. But it was, the building that was the whole CDC then is no longer there. It was much too small. I mean, it was old, whatever. It was a small brick building of 5 stories and an adjacent auditorium, so we could have meetings, and that was it. And I came to Atlanta and stayed for that week in a motel across the street. There was one motel, and then it was just woods. It was up in the country. And I had a very encouraging time. First off, I was delighted on day 2, and a little notice appeared on the bulletin board for the new officers. Don't forget there's this lunch and this dinner, and you can have interviews about bacterial or treponemal diseases or viral diseases. Going to have a meeting to try to recruit you over here. And there's a little note that says, Dr. Kahn, the director would like to see you. So the director of the CDC, I actually didn't get to see the director. I got to see the assistant director, but very nice. He was a very nice guy. He was not a doctor. He was actually a very competent bureaucrat up at the top of the CDC. He said, "Oh, Doc, we're just delighted to see you. I'm glad you've made it here. welcome. So tell us, he had several of his aides sitting there in the room staring at me like, who is this guy? Wow. And he said, what do you plan to do in your 2 years at the CDC? I said, well, sir, I'd like to learn more about epidemiology and become good at it and prepare myself to go out and serve as a physician who knows about epidemiology and help people while I'm at it. You know, he said, well, advance the field. It was cliche, all platitudes, right? Well, that's great. We knew that's all. That's what you wanted to do, and welcome. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help you, because we're delighted to have you here. I just was worried that I was going to have my neck on the block or whatever. No, he was actually very gracious, and I believe he was honest. I don't think he was actually pulling my chain.
But not every student had a notice on the
Oh, no,
bulletin board to come.
I was the only one.
Or not student, but
Yeah,
incoming
yeah. We were
officer. Yeah.
old men by then. I was, what was I don't know, 27, 28 years old. 29 maybe, not quite. That's the way it was. It was very nice, and that didn't change during my 2 years.
Was there any mention of, oh, we know the backstory on
Well,
how long it took you to get here and the controversy?
It wasn't necessary. I don't remember exactly what he said, but there's adequate hint that, you know, we know you had been a long time coming, and we accepted you back in 1968, but we knew we hoped you'd get here eventually. Now I'll leap ahead, because a decade later, roughly in the era of Jimmy Carter, not even a decade, I was able to get my Freedom of Information Act files, and I sent off a request to see what the FBI knew about me in about 6 different cities: New York City, Poughkeepsie, Boston, Cambridge, San Antonio, and I don't remember what else. Basically the places I had been. And I got from all of them, except for San Antonio, which refused to send me anything. They said, we have a lot of Henry Kahns. Would you care to tell us when you were here and what you were doing and what your plans were when you were here? I said, no, I don't want to tell you that. Well, we can't help you then. But the others, they just came, and I got lots of information. But what I found was a bunch of communications between Atlanta and Bethesda, Maryland. About how will the government decide to manage the case of Dr. Kahn's suit, and first off, before the suit, where's his commission? And it was teletypes going back and forth. CDC actually was saying, no, we did offer him a job. This is not a made-up thing. We offered him a job, and we think he should have a commission. And getting signals from Bethesda, and basically, although I don't remember seeing something from the White House, but basically, we are informed by our department superiors that he should not get a commission. So I don't really know what it was, but they were saying, find an excuse. Just say he wasn't qualified. He said, no, but he was professionally very qualified. And they would back and say, no, we will not withdraw our offer. They said, withdraw the offer. No, we won't. So CDC actually stood up for me in that era, and I give them credit for that. And none of them actually went out of their way to say to me, we did this for you. But now I know they did. I saw the names on it. David, including right to the top, David Sensor at that time was the director of CDC, the head of the Epidemic Intelligence Service. His name was on there. No, we will not withdraw the offer. It's offered on professional grounds, and we'll stand behind that. So, you know, they could have screwed me and just said, we're getting signals that they don't want you. They did not, so I'm delighted. But more to the point, I had already had some contact in advance with a CDC epidemiologist. It was happenstance. In New York, this was before Roe v. Wade, and I was working in Lincoln Hospital, and we had an abortion death in Lincoln Hospital. I was not an OBGYN resident, but everybody knew. The young lord was outraged and infuriated because this young woman had died having an abortion. New York State legalized abortion early, and she had gone through all the right steps and had a complicated medical situation. She died during the abortion in the hospital. Guess who shows up? An epidemiologist from the CDC. I said, he came with his, tell a long story. The junior officer came, and then his boss. The junior officer was James B. Kahn, K-A-H-N. My cousin Jim, who was the son of the blacklisted screenwriter, my Uncle Gordon, he had graduated a year ahead of me at Harvard Medical School. He had not had a problem with his security clearance and commission coming into the service. Had gone to the CDC, and the CDC had given him basically a hard time when he wanted to go overseas, and they discovered that he was on a security watch list. They'd already given him a commission. They couldn't let him go overseas because of his family. His father had been a blacklisted screenwriter. So James B. Kahn, my cousin, had to stay in Nevada, and he became the CDC's first abortion surveillance officer. The CDC didn't have much other than microbial diseases, but one of the two things they did that was new was they had a small cancer clusters group, very small, in chronic disease, and a family planning evaluation division, where the obstetrician epidemiologist said, there's a lot of dispute about whether we're going to legalize abortions. We need to have data. We need a surveillance system. Who can acknowledge they had an abortion, and what? How can we fit that into the epidemiological knowledge? Who's having them? Where do they have them? What are the complications? What are the long-term consequences? Big questions. So actually, my cousin Jim showed up at Lincoln Hospital as investigating this abortion death. To a bizarre character.
And had you known him growing up?
No, not really. I mean, I did know him as a child before his father fled to Mexico. His father fled to Mexico in 1950 during the House Un-American Activities Committee.
From Hollywood? Okay.
Yeah.
With his family he fled?
Yeah, well, he went first, and then the family followed. He didn't want to be in the States any longer. He felt he was in jeopardy. That's a long history otherwise, because Jim lived here in Atlanta before me. He was about to finish with the CDC when I was coming in, because he didn't have the 2-year delay that I had. But he didn't do much politically here, although he never has. I have an email from him right now, a rare event in which he said, sorry, I can't see you when you come to the Physicians for the National Health Program annual meeting. Is right 30 miles from where he lives in Pennsylvania, but he's not going to have time to see me. Okay. But he was assigned to the, he originally was assigned to the Parasitic Diseases Division, but when they wouldn't allow him to travel overseas, he was made to switch, because the parasitic diseases are so much more interesting overseas. It's not true, but that's... so he was in family planning evaluation, and they were starting an abortion surveillance system. The surveillance is a big part of epidemiology. Set up a system so you have data. How many of these happened? How many of these things died? How many of them, and so forth. So he was sent, and then his boss showed up afterwards, who was the founder of the family planning evaluation division. Really very nice guy. I owe him a lot of gratitude. This is Dr. Carl W. Tyler, Jr., who was the first obstetrician to go through the Epidemic Intelligence Service, the EIS. And it was innovation on his part. He played the bureaucracy very well to get funding, to set it up. He said, we need to know what happens with family planning. How many people get it? How many people use it? How many people have a good experience? How many people have a bad experience? So first Jim showed up in Lincoln Hospital. I barely had a chance to see him. We just had a cup of coffee together in the cafeteria, and I was back at work, and he was gone.
So he knew that you were there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And he told his boss that I was there too. And his boss knew that Henry Kahn was coming through a legal suit and might wind up at CDC because of this. So he said, he went out of his way to find me and say, can I meet you while I'm in New York City? I want to, I know you're in the same hospital where this abortion death occurred, and he was an experienced obstetrician. I'm looking at their records, and I just want to meet you while I'm here. So long story short, that was my first choice. When I got to Atlanta, I said, I would like to work for the Family Planning Evaluation Division. And I got it. I didn't become the first abortion surveillance officer. It was someone else who's now the second abortion surveillance officer. Jim was gone. But we negotiated what I would do, and I'll tell you about that. Very good choice in my way. I had to, I felt, choose a job assigned to a desk in Atlanta. In some ways, I might have preferred to just go somewhere else and do general epidemiology, see what comes up in Nebraska, or an Indian reservation, or, and do whatever I have to do. But I was aware of women's rights issues and abortion problems and family planning problems. The birth control pill had become available while I was in college, and actually I knew some of I knew college classmates who worked in John Rock's laboratory and had the early contraceptive pills, which was a rare commodity in Harvard Square in 1960. It was a prize. Mm-hmm. It was a special. I'd thought about this for a while. So the reason I needed to stay in Atlanta was Mickey had decided she was going to go to nursing school. She did not have a nursing background. She had moved from Spanish into a science education and decided she wanted to be a midwife. But to be a nurse midwife, she had to go to nursing school first. And Emory University was one of only 2 campuses in the whole country that had a 2-year nursing degree, bachelor's degree in 2 years, if you already had a bachelor's degree in something else. So she had a bachelor's degree in Spanish. The only other option was for me to go to Cleveland, because Case Western Reserve had the other program. So either they're going to assign me to Cleveland, and I'd be, I don't even think Cleveland had, maybe Cleveland did have an opening, I don't remember. But my first choice was to stay in Atlanta or go to Cleveland so that Mickey could then enter a nursing school for 2 years. Because I was going to have a 2-year commitment, she'd have a 2-year commitment, and that would work. So I narrowed it down to wanting to stay somewhere in Atlanta. And I got to work with Family Planning Evaluation Division. There was nothing else about women's medical issues or abortion or anything like that at CDC except for that division, and Carl was its visionary director. He already knew me because he'd met me in New York City. He went through a few other perfunctory reviews and said, I like you, I think this is great. So I got assigned in that April meeting to commitment on July 1, I'm going to become an officer in family planning evaluation.
And would there be multiple officers?
There were 3 or 4 others there. Yeah. Plus a statistician, the usual staff, statisticians, financial shell game,
yeah.
Play the games bureaucratically, writers, publicists, but it was small. I mean, the whole office might have been 15 or 20, but a few of them were physicians, and Carl was a board-certified obstetrician gynecologist who was seriously wanting to look at data. So he said, so what are you going to do? I said, I'm open. So he said, I've got a job for you. See what you think of this. You know that Senator Gaylord Nelson is holding hearings on thromboembolic complications of the birth control pills. That means blood clots. It's just been reviewed and revealed, and it's coming up in the Congress. There's going to be a lot of adverse publicity. I think Carl said that birth control pills have been a wonderful step forward. We need family planning of all sorts, and this is way better than condoms. But you know, it might be taken away from us around this thromboembolic complications. And even if it isn't taken away, publicity may render it useless because no one will want it. What are the options? I said, well, there's condoms and there's withdrawal and what. He said, well, do you know about IUDs? I said, I really don't. I knew a little bit. I knew they existed. And as part of my work at the Midwest Side Neighborhood Health Services program, I actually was allowed a half day a week to visit, to work in and continue to educate myself in the clinic of my choice at St. Luke's Hospital, which was only about 12 blocks away. We had a referral relationship. Emergencies, we could send somebody to St. Luke's. So I said, I volunteered to go there, and most of the time I spent in the OBGYN clinic because I had not done formal training in OBGYN. And I wanted to just learn a little bit more because I had a lot of patients that came to see me as a general doctor, and they might have had, they did have gynecologic issues. And in that, I actually put in 1 or 2 IUDs, removed a few IUDs under supervision. I was basically acting like an extra resident. So I knew something about IUDs. I'd actually removed a very funny looking one. It didn't come out right, and I got, wow, that is weird. I've never seen anything like that. Oh yeah, that's a Delcon shield. There's a lot of those. We have, anyway, that's an interesting anecdote that turns out to be relevant because my task, Carl and I agreed on a job. I was going to set up a surveillance system to write the first paper analyzing morbidity and mortality. Morbidity means how sick are you. Mortality means death. Morbidity and mortality associated with the use of IUDs. And so I slugged away at it. I asked a lot of advice. I talked to statisticians, and we set up a protocol which was a one-page questionnaire that we could send out to 50,000 doctors. 50,000 doctors by mail. What else is there? And it would basically say a few things that would establish the denominator. Key point of epidemiology. The denominator is how many people could there have been, and now how many were there. Okay. So the denominator was going to estimate how many people get IUDs in a year. And then the numerator for this ratio would be how many of them get morbidity, which we defined as have to be hospitalized, or mortality, died. Whew. So we got to figure out how to make this possible, and this was unprecedented. We're used to epidemics that are usually diarrhea in an American Legion Hall somewhere, and there was a church supper, and they had potato salad and the carved ham and a couple of green beans and warm coffee, and and then 17 people got sick. How do you figure out what was the, no deaths maybe, but you have to figure out what are you going to culture? How many of these people might have gotten sick the day before they came to this? Whatever, all this. But that's not 50,000 people. That's 25 people or 100. And now we're talking about unknown. Nothing like that had ever been done. So I designed this protocol. I said, we're going to need computers. Well, CDC had not used computers for anything but budgeting before. I mean, they actually had not used it to reckon cases and stuff, and this was new. 1972. I mean, they had used it for some things, but it was trivial, not in the big scale, big numbers. We'd used computers to calculate a p-value, but the data is already there. You plug it into a very primitive. So I designed this questionnaire that's short enough that it wouldn't turn off too many doctors, and we sent it out. I had to fly to the AMA in Chicago and negotiate their approval of this, so they would give us the mailing list they had of doctors. And I had to fly to the American Osteopathic Association, get their approval. A small minority of doctors are osteopaths. And select from their list a good sample of all the OBGYNs and a small fraction of the family practitioners and a small fraction of the public health doctors, just because they too have something to do with IUDs. And I designed that, and we sent it out, and got a 49% response rate, which was pretty good. From which there were 5 deaths and several hundred, or was it several thousand, I can't remember. Might have been, let's see, it was over 1,000. I don't remember the numbers. I can find out. I've published this, so I should be able to look it up. We came up with the first estimates of how many Americans get an IUD, how many women in America get an IUD. We were able to project it in a year. We asked the specific, the questionnaire went out the last week of June of '73, and it arrived on doctors' desks the first week of July, and we said, in the first 6 months of 1973, did you put in any IUDs? If yes, tell us how many. Estimate until we categorize it, and then we can project from that about how many IUDs probably were inserted in the USA. And then the rest was about, are you aware of anybody in the last 6 months who had to be hospitalized potentially because of their IUD? And we got several thousand, I believe, positives, of which I had to remove the duplicates, because in some communities, 4 doctors would report the same case. They heard about it. In my hospital, yeah, we did have one who was just, I think it was April, I think, and we could figure out, we got details of which we weren't allowed to know the names, but just tell us, were they the patient in this age range? Was the patient, what characteristics could we say about who had this? And we had a few cases of deaths. Long story short, just before it went out, I said, why don't we add a question at the end? If you were aware of any hospitalization, do you know what kind of IUD was used? And so we left it was open-ended, but people wrote in Lippy's Loop, or Copper T, or Dalcon Shield, or whatever. When the data came in, I ready to put them into punch cards, and the punch cards went through a big machine, and we had this big computerized file, and when we had to program in Fortran, I had to learn Fortran for this, and analyze it, and I published a paper on what is the use prevalence of IUDs in America. I was the first author as a young doctor in the Journal of the AMA, which is a prestigious thing, and then my next paper was on hospitalizations. Well, that's not true. Let me just see. The next paper, I think, was on mortality. And we just were able to show that the mortality rate was actually pretty low. There were mortalities, but compared to what we already knew about mortalities associated with oral contraceptives, it was better, less of a problem. And so we could reassure women that this was not an impossible choice. But when further analysis showed that the hospitalizations, of which there were several thousand, were skewed way toward the Dalcon shields. And specifically, the medical details of those hospitalizations were sepsis infections. And basically, I wrote the paper which made a pretty convincing case that the Dalcon shield was differentiated from all the others with a much higher incidence of septic abortion, which meant basically, number one, it didn't really prevent pregnancy very well. And when it did allow a pregnancy to happen, it was a septic pregnancy. And so I published more papers, more than the EIS officer usually publishes, because I had a big hot topic. So I'm the guy who turned in the Dalcon shield and caused it to be taken off the market. thanks to your tax dollar at work, I really got to do a project I enjoyed, worked on it. And while I did that, I was also, I got satisfaction from that. It made me happy, and I was able to work with good colleagues like Carl Tyler and the statisticians he connected me to, and the other young doctors on his team. And since I was already board certified in internal medicine, which was not true for anybody else at my level at CDS, I said, can I do a volunteer doctor in the community role? And I'd like to work at Grady Hospital for a half day a week as a volunteer. Is that okay? And the CEC said, sure. And since you'll write this into your orders so that you're covered for our insurance. You don't need private insurance because you're doing this as under orders for your EIS experience. So I became, I thought, without any trouble, a volunteer physician at Grady. There was trouble because I wanted to do primary care at Grady Hospital. I had never been to Grady, really. I'd seen it, but so I wanted to do primary care. And the chief of medicine there said, we don't have any openings. I said, well, I'm a volunteer. We don't have any openings. We don't do primary care. He said, it's a very famous man, J. Willis Hurst, chief of medicine for many years at Grady and at Emory, and head of cardiology at Grady and at Emory, and LBJ's cardiologist and so forth. And he said, we don't do primary care. I said, but I am interested in this. I worked as a primary care doctor for a year, and I would like to be able to help with supervising the general medical clinic. No, I have an opening in rheumatology. Be happy to have you, Dr. Kahn. You have 2 Harvard degrees. It's great. I said, I'm not a rheumatologist. I was thinking, I passed my boards, but I'm not a rheumatologist. But we got an opening. I said, that's not what I want. I want to do general primary care with a prevention emphasis. Common diseases, ordinary people. No, we don't do that. Called me back. We have an opening in nephrology. No. So then he said, this was over months of negotiation for a free volunteer job.
At Grady, which is Atlanta's big public.
We don't do primary care at Grady. He said, that's for inferior medical schools. He repeated this over and over. Primary care is for inferior medical schools. We transplant hearts. He said, I said, well, that's too late. Maybe we could prevent having to transplant these hearts. Anyway, it was not pretty. But he finally said, okay, you can do it. No need for me to block you any longer. What day do you want? I said, any day. He said, all right, Monday afternoons. Go down to general clinic. So I went to general clinic to look at it. It was a disaster. One big room in the basement of Grady Hospital then. No appointment system, no continuity of care, never had a supervisory doctor, just interns and residents just stumbling through it and just grabbing charts off the pile.
And this is just people walking in.
Standing on line all day to get in until they cut it off.
For non-emergent care.
Yeah, right. It was. I did some little calculations with my elementary epidemiologic skills, and I think we're taking care of 400,000 indigent people in 2 counties here, indigent adults. Probably 400,000 of them in one room with no appointment system. How do we do this? We've been doing it for years, no problem. And who's the supervisor? They don't need a supervisor. Any dumb intern can work there in the pit. They called it the pit, right? I guess I should put this on the record. I saw the chief resident at that time, whose name I know, but I will not put it here. He said, come on down. On the first of the month, I'll show you how we assign the doctors to this. He said, all right, you motherfuckers. He said, he aligned everybody, all the interns and residents up. We need 8 people to work in the pit this month. You, and you. You're the pit for the month. Okay, and then they went down there, start the next day, and no supervision, no nothing, no support, no teaching.
No orientation, no.
No, it was just awful. I mean, it was much better than that in Boston, but not perfect. At least we had appointment systems in Boston. They were flawed, but they worked. So So I actually started doing that.
And was Grady, it was integrated by this point?
It was. It certainly by law. But most of the patients were black, but not all. And they had undesignated the white and black sides of the hospital. But there are plenty of memories about that, and the black and white nurses still barely knew each other, although that was beginning to change. I had some mentors there who were pleased with my kindness and my intention, but they had no idea what to do with it. Director of Kidney Diseases, Elbert Tuttle Jr., who was the son of Elbert Tuttle Sr., the famous appeals court judge who supported the civil rights decisions in the 50s. He was head of nephrology, and he supported me verbally. He ran a good clinic for really balanced care of his kidney patients. And Nanette Linger, who was a rising woman in the cardiology department, stood up for good principles, and she supported me, but it didn't have any substance behind it. I was basically the first attending physician, that's the name, the supervising physician.
As a one-day-a-week volunteer?
1/2 a day.
Yeah.
Right. And in that time, I saw just dreadful things. One of the things I saw, and I won't go into names now either, but I saw one intern who always came late and always left early, and I was allowed to look at the charts at the end of the day, see if I see any problems. I don't see the patient, I don't know what, these are no electronic health record. Leave me a stack of his charts, and every one of them had beautiful drawings in them, and he had these depictions of the heart murmur going this way and the heart going this way, and this neurological reflexes all laid out in every one of them. But he came late and left early. How he did this, I have no clue. You know, I said, I can't really believe this guy, and he was always so well coiffed too. It was just hard to believe what was going on. But I actually said to one of my elder mentors, and I don't understand about John. I'm really troubled. I can't understand what he's doing because it looks beautiful in the chart, but how he gets to do that. I could not have done that for one patient. He does it in 7 patients and he's gone. You know, how does he? Well, don't raise any questions about him because he is Willis's pet. The chief of medicine. Willis thinks he's a genius and has designated him for fast track, move this boy up. So I bit my tongue because I really didn't understand what was happening. A few years later, with Willis Hurst's recommendation, that particular doctor made it to the Harvard Cardiology Service at Peter Penn Brigham Hospital in Boston, and was a rising star with several high-level publications to his record, until they caught him falsifying data at Harvard. A medical student caught him late at night just making up numbers and publishing data, all of which has been retracted now from the New England Journal of Medicine stuff. I had recognized this guy who had been an intern in my primary care clinic, making up crap and making it up. And they caught him at Harvard after nobody else noticed all the way up. And the one that I really want to share with you is the anecdote about the young intern whose name I don't remember. This was 40 cots in a room, right, with just curtains between them. He throws back the curtain, and he comes out, and he goes to the middle of the room and leans on the column. It's a basement room, and there is columns. And I said, so what's going on? I went over to say, can I help? You know, yes, you look stressed. I'd like to help. What's happening? It's nothing. It's okay. I said, is your patient at risk? No, the patient's doing pretty well. I think I know what to do. So why are you so distressed? I am distressed. It's just something happened. So tell me about it. He said, I've just had an experience. It's the first time in my residency that I've ever seen the same patient twice. That was his experience. He said, it just got to me emotionally. I just realized how meaningful that was and what I could have learned out of this experience, because I've never before seen the same patient twice. Right? This is the way that system worked. I give the guy credit. I mean, he had the insight and the morals to say, I bet there's something important here.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else seemed to give a damn. So I was writing memos after I'd been there a few months saying, I'm disturbed at the way in which this clinic runs. We could make it better. I'd like to work on improving it. And I had mentioned a number of things like appointment systems that would, and planned assignments of doctors to the days so we'd know who's going to be there. And the doctors themselves would know, so they could say when the patient left their care in the hospital, I want to see you back in 6 weeks. I'll be here on Thursday afternoon. Can't do that. So I got summoned to the director's office at Grady Hospital, the medical director. Dr. Kahn, glad to meet you. I'm aware you're a volunteer and I appreciate your service, and so, but I've been getting some disturbing concerns. In fact, Dr. Stone has sent me this memo that you wrote, which he wanted me to see, and I have looked at it, not twice, because I find it quite disturbing. Here in this memo, you use the phrase continuity of care. He said, I don't believe I've ever heard that phrase before. Medical director at Grady Hospital. He said, it sounds like a lot of sentimental crap to me. He said, we don't need to do that. Every intern can see a patient in 4 minutes, and that's not time enough to get into this soft, sentimental stuff about continuity of care. He said, I hope you will just learn to live with that. That's just not the way we do it at this hospital. You know, we don't need continuity of care. Right?
And was that a new concept at this time?
No. It was, well, in my literature knowledge, it was not a new concept. Even if I didn't read journals, I do read journals, I've always read journals, but even if I didn't read journals, the concept was exactly in the direction of what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a doctor who could see the same patient twice. How about 20 times? How about guiding you through your cancer and out the other side? How about your hypertension when it finally comes under control and we get the right combination of medicines that you can tolerate and afford and that your family doesn't object or whatever, you know, and how's your nephew doing, you know, kind of thing. Anyway, he had not seen the term before and he thought it was something bad happening. Well, I shared this with a few people at the political levels, the county health director, and I got up to the Fulton County commissioners, who actually said that they thought that their funding of Grady Hospital should be modified to require that Grady start to do primary care. And they did. They made that a condition, and so by the time that year was up, there was already move. Things were changing. We're going to think about primary care, and I was offered a job. Now, the doctors at Grady then all had to come through Emory University, the only medical school in town. There's a contract going back to the 50s between the university and the hospital authority, Fulton DeKalb Hospital Authority. So doctors and related professionals working here will only be those certified and brought into the service by Emory University. Okay. So I was already there by Emory because Willis Hurst had appointed me for no money. But who was going to run the satellite clinics? Because it would have to be Grady Hospital satellite clinics staffed by Emory-affiliated physicians. And so they ran it by the Department of Medicine. They said, no way, we're not going to go to primary care in neighborhood clinics. And the plan was basically, if we have primary care, I said it has to be decentralized. I think there's no way we can change the culture in such a big anonymous clinic. How about opening 1 or 2 or 3 neighborhood clinics in neighborhoods of very high need, have doctors be there, not downtown, see the patients, and the whole family can come in. I can see Mr. Jones and Mrs. Jones, and we know where the supermarket is, and we know, all that kind of stuff, if there's a supermarket. And that got traction, but they didn't know how to staff it. The Department of Medicine said, no way, we won't send our doctors there. And the pediatrics department did the same thing. And the OBGYN department said the same thing. So they had to, at the dean's level, create a new department called Emory School of Medicine, Department of Community Medicine, which means humble folks who are willing to go out and work in the neighborhood, basically. So I became the second appointee to that department. There was an older doctor who got there first, a nice guy, a good internist who had emotional issues. He was very, not bad issue. I think he had a tendency to bad depression. He needed a protected environment, which he thought he could have this way, and he did it well. It was good. His patients liked him. He was a nice guy, and he was there, but not a lot of academic pretense, none. So I was number 2. He was hired before me, but I came in. And the 2 of us were the first internists.
And this is after your service at the...
Oh, yeah. So I was the one. They offered me a job, and I accepted it. So I was going to become, in August of 1974, I became a salaried Emory employee with duties assigned to Grady Hospital. And the department was community medicine. Even though I was board certified in internal medicine, they offered me a nominal appointment, but no budget line, no nothing. You are also an associate as an internist. But so we didn't get any cooperation from medicine or pediatrics or OBGYN. We just had to figure out what we could do with just Charles Hamilton and me. And eventually, though, they grew. They got budget, moved it up, and so it became, for 2 years, the only clinic there was Northwest Grady Clinic, which was in a housing project then called Perry Homes. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't exist anymore, but we were located in Perry Homes. And subsequently, I became the medical director of the next one, which was DeKalb Grady Clinic in East Lake Meadows Housing Project, also known as Little Vietnam. And I got 6 apartments and worked them out and redesigned them a little bit to make a clinic there. 6 contiguous apartments, made a clinic out of it. Hired a pediatrician, 2 other internists, and occasional OBGYN. But without any, they were people we drew in and got nominal appointments to medicine or pediatrics, but no substantive support whatsoever from those. And no medical students or residents were allowed to come out and be with us. We don't do that.
And you actually worked in the clinics. That's where...
Oh, yeah. At that point, I was no longer going to the downtown general medical clinic. I said, that culture is not this. I see no hope. That has changed. Definitely for the better. It could not have gotten worse. But there are now appointment systems. There are now fixed appointments. There are now fixed supervising physicians. Department of Primary Internal Medicine. Willis Hurst is long gone. His successors have made that part of the service, but I know they do it grudgingly. They're required to do that now by the Health Resources Services Administration at the federal level, which says we pay for your residents. We pay for some of the medical school infrastructure to help you develop medical curricula. You have to include primary care, so now we have primary care, but they're not institutionally committed to it. But it's better. It's definitely better. And downtown Grady now has primary care pods, Unit 1, Unit 5, Unit 2, whatever, where people will say, I think I know the doctors here. I'll come in and see that group. That's good. But the neighborhood clinics were cut off by Emory in the 80s. I can't remember the year, but in the middle of the night, the dean woke up and said, Grady owes us a lot of money, and I'm going to decide how I'm going to slice their budget, because there's no way that Grady will pay what I think we should be getting from Grady. So they canceled all their commitments to the neighborhood clinics. We had 18 doctors salaried through Emory in the neighborhood clinics, and we had 4 clinics then operating. I was the medical director of just one of them. We had, I think it was 4 at the time, 18 doctors in there, and the next morning there was 0. I mean, there was a lot of confusion, and Grady quickly picked up the slack, and then by joint agreement, without any agreement at all, just under the table, they agreed to abrogate the contract, which said all doctors working there have to be from Emory. Emory cut them off, and Grady started hiring its own doctors for the same neighborhood clinics because Grady wanted no part of that. I was the only surviving neighborhood clinic doctor because I had tenure by then. I had published a bunch of papers and had been already, was teaching a course to Emory medical students, course coordinator, course director, and had tenure, and they couldn't fire me under those rules. So
But did they reassign you?
Well, I was allowed, I don't understand exactly where my salary came from after that, but I didn't need to know. It was okay. They allowed me, I continued to see patients half-time.
So you could still go to the
I could still
actual
go
clinic
there,
and
yeah,
work.
and work, but all the other doctors were no longer Emory doctors. So the ability to recruit doctors to work there was diminished because doctors might accept the lower salary and the working conditions if at least they had academic acknowledgement, but they no longer had that. They were just greedy salary doctors.
And what was the demographic of the doctors at this time?
Generally, but not entirely, the majority, I'd say, were graduates of American medical schools. Some of them were excellent. Some of them were just mediocre. But they were, I guess, they were physicians who were less oriented to academic careers. Some of them had some disabilities, minor stuff, not a terrible thing. Others had marital commitments. That means I'm not so flexible. I need to just have a job, whatever. Occasional foreign medical graduates, some of whom were spouses of Emory faculty, who were more privileged. By and large, I got along with most of them. There were 1 or 2 catastrophes that I had to deal with, but it was a compatible group overall.
And this is through the whole tenure of that program.
It's still going on.
But when Emory was involved in staffing and after it
Right.
tended to be the same sort of mix of people.
Right.
And were they?
It got a little bit less academic after the academic thing was sliced, but even in the earlier period, those who might have had academic credentials, only a few of them really stuck it out as academics. They basically fell back into primary care, or else they moved on elsewhere.
And a more balanced, even mix of men and women, white and black.
Increasingly became
Hispanic.
black as blacks came out of medical school. Yes, usually black women and black women who were starting a family, and so that was definitely what the staff looked like. So I did that for quite a few years, mixed with the career of trying to teach medical, what they call undergraduates. It means those who are in medical school but not in residency yet. And I was the course director for many years of a class called The Doctor, the Patient, and the Community. So it was social medicine, a little bit of medical anthropology, medical sociology, epidemiology to some degree. But these were all elementary concepts, not allowed to move very far, and we were informed that this is not a serious subject. We don't, most of the time they didn't even give grades. Or if they did, they say, you can't give an exam.
And is this an elective or?
No, it was a required course for everybody, but it was underemphasized. However, I always, in every year, got a half dozen, 2, 11, whatever, students who got it and really wanted to pursue that, and some of them are now already well-developed in that area, but by and large, most of the students really knew it wasn't serious. We found ways to encourage them to show up, and most of them did, but all the signals were, this is not really important, we just come there because they tell us we have to learn this. Social medicine is,
Has that changed?
and I was never able to set up the longitudinal elective like I had at Harvard as a student. This experiment in medical students get to go a half day a week to the same primary care site and get to know a few patients well and follow them. Just a few. I could not make that happen. I'm told it happens now, but I've never seen it actually, so I don't know how it works. I think it's only to a few people who volunteer. I'm sorry, let me just at least cancel this. I'll have to turn it off anyway. My neighbor, I hope she's not in trouble. Anyway, so I did that for a number of years.
Into the mid to late 80s or?
Into 2001.
Oh, okay. So from like 74-ish?
So 27 years on the Emory faculty with tenure. And also along that time, I made grant applications, which was not expected from my department. That department was not expected to do academic stuff, but I wrote some grant applications, and although my original department chairman, Thomas Sellers Jr., was a very open, warm, supportive guy, he wasn't attuned to high-flying academic pressures, and he wasn't able to give me a lot of support, but I had to do what I could on my own. And create some pathways in the department that made it possible to have a grant portfolio and that kind of stuff. I had a small grant from the American Heart Association and then a large grant from the NIH that lasted 5 years and generated several papers. But that's off the point of this kind of review. When Tom Sellers retired, his successors were much less imaginative, much more bureaucratic and mercenary, and at some point one of the successors was robbing my grant left and right under false pretenses, and he was very jealous and had no successes of his own, and although he was a board certified pediatrician, he knew nothing about pediatric practice. He was finally fired from Emory when it was revealed that he had indicated that he was getting part of his salary from Grady because he was a regular practicing physician at the Cab Grady Clinic where I was the medical director. He had never told me that he was at the Cab Grady Clinic. He had never showed up there. And I found out that he was actually deriving something like 30% of his salary from the time he spent there, and no one in the clinic had ever seen him. You know, he was a very dishonest, but that's the way you do it in academia. You find ways to feather your own nest, and you make claims that nobody challenges. So fortunately, the dean made appropriate inquiries, did a sample of 10 nurses and 10 doctors. Have you ever seen Dr. C at all? No. Have you ever seen Dr. C? No. No. And no one had ever seen him before, but he was claiming, I don't know, something like 30% of his time there. And that was an unacceptable accounting error. But that was sort of within the range of how department chairs work. God forbid he should get his own grant. And he was bleeding my grant money for his own purposes, but that was small, not thousands of dollars. Hundreds of dollars here would disappear from my photocopying account into his, that kind of stuff. Now, in that early period, I haven't said anything about the bird.
I did want to go back, before we get there, I know we absolutely want to talk about the bird, but you had mentioned the research and the papers that you wrote on IUDs. And
for the audience, that's an intrauterine contraceptive device, or just intrauterine device, in the uterus device, a little piece of plastic with a string off it, okay, which is a common contraceptive these days and should be supported, but unfortunately I contributed to the horror about how bad they can be because I identified the one model that was bad.
And that's exactly what I wanted to follow up on. I'm 42, and so when I was coming of age and going through,
you might have been an IUD baby for all I know.
Human health and development, sex ed courses in middle school and high school in the 80s and 90s, they would mention, tell you what the options available are, and they would mention IUDs, but would then quickly discredit, like, oh, these are dangerous, these are...
Well, that's regrettable, because we never said that.
But I know now there's been this resurgence of popularity.
Yeah, we showed that the IUD was associated with less mortality than oral contraceptives. Of course, oral contraceptives have gotten better now, too, so they might be roughly the same. It's a risk small enough that I wouldn't hesitate to recommend it to an informed user. But who am I to say you should use something with a risk? There's a risk from taking a flu shot, I suppose. There's a risk from taking a penicillin tablet. But these are we can quantify those risks, and they're very, very, very small. And similarly with the oral contraceptives and the IUDs. Unfortunately, the Kahn shield was badly designed, not properly tested. There were no tests. It was the Food and Drug Administration, not the Food and Drug and Device Administration. Devices were not tested. I went and testified before a committee of the US FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and I took out a paper clip out of my pocket and I said, I'm marketing this as a cardiac pacemaker. You can't stop me. And that was right. And as a consequence, they did modify the mandate for the FDA to give them some authority over devices, of which the Kahn shield is a very good example why they needed that. So now they are better tested. Not enough, but better tested. So yeah, I regret that although we were very clear to say this was a unique problem with that particular device and we recommend not using that device, it was interpreted globally as an indictment of IUDs, which we never intended. Mm-hmm. An anecdote. It was devised by a professor of OBGYN at Johns Hopkins University, the Kahn shield. What's wrong with that? How bad could that be? Well, it turned out he was a very bad man. In fact, he falsified data. We have learned that. He lied, he withheld, and he marketed this unconscionably through the H. Robbins Company as a superior contraceptive, which it was not by any means. When we published our papers and it was taken off the market because of that, they voluntarily, that's all you could do, they voluntarily ceased sales under this barrage of bad publicity, and that took care of it. That particular professor who designed it and marketed it, promoted it, resigned promptly from his tenured position at Johns Hopkins University and got a new job. He became the family planning director for Augusto Pinochet in the dictatorship in Chile. And that's where he finished his career. For those of you who don't know what Pinochet was, he was a dreadful, dreadful tyrant, no lover of women or women's health. and that's where he went to work. So let me tell you another good, well, the story about CDC, I can wrap up with one wonderful anecdote. While I was working for Carl Tyler in family planning evaluation, this is where Pinochet comes in, I got a call from Victor Seidel, the guy who was my junior faculty teacher at Harvard in this family planning elective, the well-intended but a little bit lost internist who wanted to do community health and build a career, and he did finally build a career. But he was still at Harvard at the time. Well, no, he may have moved to, he probably moved to Albert Einstein by then. But he called me at my desk at CDC. He must have gotten my number from Mickey or something. I don't know how he got the number, but he called me and he said, I got to take your time. Sorry, I know I'm interrupting you at your desk. I said, well, yeah, but it's okay, Vic. I'm glad to hear from you. You know that there's a coup going on in Chile, don't you? I said, yeah, I do. I just heard about it and it sounds terrible. But he said, I've been assigned some names. I've got a list here of people who have to get out of Chile in a hurry. Their lives are in danger. And I'm assigning you a name, and I just plead with you, do what you can to save this woman's life. And so he said to me on the phone to my office at CDC, you are responsible for Doctora Tehualda Monreal. She is the chair of the epidemiology department at the University of Chile. She was a classmate in medical school of Salvador Allende, who has just died in this coup. Her name is on the list to be killed. And I've learned that, since he didn't know her, I'd never heard of her. He said, I've learned that her career is renowned because she's developed the field of abortion epidemiology in South America. She's figured out ways to estimate the abortion burden, who gets abortions, what happens when they do. And this is a very special field. And he said, I think you can find it. This sounds like something you're doing, right? I said, well, I'm not exactly, but I know who is, and I will help. This is a shout out to the CDC, because I just went up the hall to Carl Tyler's office and said, Carl, I need to talk to you. Here's what I've just learned. Here's this person. Do you know Tehualda Monreal? He said, never heard of her, but it sounds like she's an interesting woman, right? And does she speak English? I said, I don't even know for sure, but I'll help her. I speak Spanish, and I would like to help. What can we do? He said, let me think about it. 5 minutes, he said, I've made an appointment with the director of CDC. It's David Senser at the time. He'll see us in 10 minutes. Let's go up to his office. So this is to show you how much things have changed, because CDC was an idealistic place at that point, and I really loved it. And I learned later that they had defended me, but I didn't even know that. I just knew it worked fairly well.
Well, that you could get an appointment
With the director in 10
in 10
minutes.
minutes.
Right. Well,
Even in exceptional circumstances.
Right, he told them something that got his attention, and he cared enough. He knew the world scene. So we go to David Senser's office, we sit down, okay, what's up? He said, so Carl explained it to me, and then turned to me, explained it briefly, and after me, he said, do you have anything more to add? I said, but I knew about my source, Victor Seidel, who's a reliable, smart man, professor at Albert Einstein now. And he said, well, I get it, said David, this is serious, and it sounds like something we could use here, right? Carl said, right, we could use somebody like that. So he said, let's see what we can do. He paused a couple of minutes and he said to his secretary, get me Henry Kissinger on the phone. Right? For those of you who don't know, Kissinger was the Secretary of State, was the architect of the coup in which Salvador Allende, who himself was a physician, a public health physician, and the president of Chile, was killed. And David Senser said, get me Henry Kissinger on the phone. And in 10 minutes, we had Henry Kissinger on the telephone. And I'm not making this up. It's a real story. I was in shock. I just couldn't imagine this was happening. So there he was. You could hear Henry Kissinger's German inflected voice on the phone. He said, so what do you want? And David Senser explained in good, short, simple terms what the issue was. And Kissinger said, I see. Okay, I agree with your request. Here's what I will do. I will inform the embassy in Santiago that they should pick her up in an embassy car at her house no later than 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and she should be ready, and they'll take her to the airport. And we will line up something later to get through all the paperwork and get her into the States. And it's up to you to just give her a job. And so David said, fine, we'll give her a 2-year fellowship to work with us at CDC. Is that beautiful? Or so I'm touched. And the next morning, it was an overnight flight, I guess, from Chile. I remember picking her up at Atlanta Airport. Just a delightful woman. She did speak English quite well. She's carrying a little suitcase and a shoebox, cardboard shoebox with a manuscript that she had been writing by hand for a paper. When we helped her find an apartment, she stayed at our house for a couple of weeks, and then we found her an apartment, and she stayed at CDC for several years afterwards, helping us to develop our abortion surveillance system. And we probably saved her life, because in the following 2 days or so, her house was burned, inexplicably burned to the ground. Our house just was burned.
Did she have other family that had to flee, or
No.
that were unable to flee?
I never got the details of her domestic life to my satisfaction, but she was basically estranged from her husband. I don't know what the circumstances were. She did have a son who was, I think, living in the UK. I think her husband had been an English diplomat. However, I have since met him. As a CDC employee in later times, I was paid to go to a meeting in Santiago de Chile, and she had returned there. After coming at CDC, she subsequently left the States and became family planning director for Mozambique. And from there, after things calmed down, then Pinochet was deposed and the democratic government returned to Chile. She returned to Chile. So I contacted her, and she was by that point retired in Santiago, outside of Santiago, a nice little bungalow and a fruit orchard. It's a beautiful place. And she said, I'll make sure my son will pick you up and take you out to see me. And so I got to meet him. He was returned to Chile. And I still don't know much about her. His father, I don't get it exactly, but he was back in Chile. And I got to see her before she died. Before her death, she had a visitor house by the president of Chile, Doctora Bachelet, who was also a physician and a liberal Democrat. And she put an honor of something or other, Chilean cross of honor or something, around Tegualdo's head and said, "You are a hero of our country." But she would not have made it through 1973 were it not for Victor Seidel calling me, calling Carl, going to David Sensor, calling Henry Kissinger, and rescuing her in a U.S. Embassy car to take her to the airport, basically protected. So that's, now, while I was at CDC, I had a little bit of extra time on my hand. It wasn't as busy as being an intern or resident at Lincoln Hospital or Boston City. I mean, I could go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and take off at 4:30 or 5. I often worked a little more than that. You know, if it was a crunch about a paper I was working on, I put in extra time, but not a hell of a lot. So I fell in with wonderful people in Atlanta. On arrival in Atlanta, I already knew of several people that I would find enjoyable through mutual friends. While Mickey and I lived in New York in the beginning of our marriage, we were introduced to Sue Thrasher. Have you met Sue, or is she? Okay. So Sue Thrasher enters the scene here. Sue Thrasher was a volunteer at the Bird, but also a steadfast community activist and later academic in their own right, but not at that point. Sue Thrasher went to college in Suwanee, Tennessee, but migrated to Atlanta after college and joined the civil rights movement. Acted with SNCC and related groups. And from Atlanta, she was trying to raise money from New York sources and other, I don't know exactly what she was doing, but she knew somebody in New York who was also a resident at Lincoln. And she called him and said, I'm coming to New York, and will you help me find a place to stay? He didn't have a space for her, but he said, I think I find you one. And he referred Sue Thrasher to stay with Mickey and me. We had an extra bed in our apartment, which was lovely. And Sue Thrasher was great. And she understood that I was waiting for a commission, hoping to come to Atlanta. I think that was why our mutual friend directed her to me, because he knew I was struggling to get to go to Atlanta, and I'd like to meet Sue. Well, we loved Sue. It was great. We had a great relationship and meeting. And so when I got my commission and was coming to Atlanta, Sue was engaged to find us a place to live.
And this is, when would she have come to New York? And
it probably was in 71.
Okay.
I just was on the edge of winning my suit.
Yeah, because Sue, I think she had gone to college in Nashville.
I don't think so. It was in Tennessee. It was definitely in Tennessee, but I thought it was.
And then had been a leader in the Southern Student Organizing Committee.
Absolutely.
And involved in the Bird and a whole lot of other things.
She at that point was already living in Atlanta. She had come to Atlanta, but active around the South, around Highlander Center, where she later was active. But in any case, we got to know her. And so I said, Sue, I'm going to come to Atlanta after all. And thinking I would like to live near where she lived. She shared an apartment with Tom and Steffi Coffin. And actually, when I came to Atlanta initially, a couple of days ahead of Mickey's arrival, for whatever reason, we had to stagger our flights to come. I slept on the floor in that apartment on 9th Street, which I thought, that's the neighborhood I'd like to live in, because Sue and Tom are happy there, and they have a nice little apartment, and I can find a place here. Sue said, well, yeah, but let me look around, I'll find you something else. So she found a house, a bungalow, in what's now Ponce Island neighborhood, just between, very near where Manuel's Tavern is now. She said, well, it's not the same as Midtown. It's not the same as where Tom and Steffi, but I think that's the coming neighborhood. And Little Five Point is going to be, Little Five Points is nearby. It's going to be a place you'll like. And I found you a place. There's a house that's just gone up for rental, a little bungalow, and it's only $200 a month. And
on what street?
Blue Ridge Avenue. The little street between Ponce and North Avenue, but parallel to them. It's a little street between them.
I know it.
Behind, well, I still live in that house. She picked out that house for Mickey and me to rent for $200 a month, which was 1/3 of what we paid in New York City for a 2-room apartment or 3-room apartment. It was, and it was an 8-room house. It was not in great repair, but it was livable. And so when I knew I was coming to Atlanta, Mickey said, let's do it. Let's live in town. I said, but everybody else coming to CDC, the young professionals, they get a ranch house out in Tucker somewhere with a cyclone fence around it or something like this. No, let's go in town where the community is or the activism is. And so I give Mickey a lot of credit. She articulated why that was a good idea. She was going to start nursing school, which would involve going between Emory out in the suburbs and Grady downtown, and we'd be right in between. And I had a similar issue, working at Grady downtown, being at CDC on the Emory campus. It was a perfect spot for us, and we were near the activism center. So thanks to Sue, we quickly merged into the Bird community and went to meetings with Bird and met wonderful people. I'd already met Tom and Steffi because I'd slept on their apartment floor. And then we had our own house, but we met with them, and they said, you want to write? And Mickey had some time. She was a student, she's a good student, and she wanted to meet people in the movement as well. She had classmates in her nursing school who were fairly supportive and progressive, so she found time to volunteer, and I did too. So I volunteered just to do some writing for the Bird. I went to some Bird meetings, but the perilous times of the Bird, with the firebombing and all that kind of stuff, had already passed. We were becoming sort of institutionalized by 1972. And I was able to write a medical column. And I recruited another EIS officer to write the medical columns with me. That was Dan Blumenthal. So between the two of us, we reframed the medical column spot in the Bird as the Great Spockled Dock. And we alternately, not every week, but many weeks in the course of a year, would contribute a column, either his, and he was Dr. Feelgood in there, or mine. I was Dr. Sawyer Legoff. And we answered questions about popular medical questions for the street community, basically. Of course, they weren't really questions. It was only rare that someone actually sent us a question, so we made up questions, and then we answered them. Dan, who died back in July, was Dr. Feelgood, and I recently looked at some of his columns of those days. I have copies of them. He wrote things about, he was a pediatrician. Immunizations, head lice, pubic lice, skin rashes, do you want to take sleeping pills or not, that kind of stuff. And I wrote other things. Some things about diet, some things about birth control. Of course, I knew something about that. What are jock straps for? Why do you need a jock strap? I didn't think you did. There was a bunch of questions of that sort which we could answer in 3 or 4 short paragraphs, and that was fun, writing those things. The other occasional communicator, although you may not have him on your list, he preceded us, but then he was less active by that time, was Dr. Peter Bourne. Did you run across Peter Bourne? He was a writer.
We have not talked with him.
He was a writer for the Great Speckled Bird, a physician, not related to CDC, but related to Emory. His father was an Emory professor of anatomy, and he had gone to medical school also. He was tapering down his involvement with the Bird by 1972 because he was increasingly involved with his friend Jimmy Carter, who was the governor. And he became Jimmy Carter's drug czar. And Jimmy Carter needed someone to look at the drug abuse question in Georgia. And Peter Bourne took that role on, and he followed Jimmy Carter to the White House. So at that point, he was not really eligible to be writing for the Bird. But he was Dr. Aquarius. So the 3 of us were the contributors to the Great Spockled Dock column. But Peter Bourne preceded us, writing as Dr. Aquarius for the Great Spockled Dock. But it was a good time. I mean, I enjoyed meeting with the Bird folks. Of course, we wrote by hand and then typed it up. If we were smart, we kept a carbon copy of what we did, but that was the way we did it. We didn't have to do a lot about composition every week of going to mocking up the paper and laying it out. We had much better people doing that stuff within the volunteer staff. Mickey got involved in composition and editing. She's very good at that. And when she finished nursing school, she was pregnant, and we had our first son shortly after she finished nursing school and I finished the CDC. I was a new faculty member with Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance at Emory University. So she, as a new mother, wanted to spend time with the baby, well spent, but wanted also to do some volunteer. So she spent more time on the Bird, and she did a lot more of the composition and eventually became the Bird's editor. But that was for a limited period of time. The Bird was dying at that point, and we had trouble with budgets. I and other physicians did what we could to supplement the budget, but none of us was a millionaire. And, we can add in a couple $100 here or there. I feel like I made some enjoyable hours for myself writing and revising my short contributions. I also wrote a few restaurant reviews. I'd spot a new restaurant and say, I'd like to try that. And I'd write up a 3-paragraph review with a little bit of humor and write comment. But that was really all I did for the bird itself, but I also was privileged to know these same people around the other issues that we shared. I got to go to demonstrations with them, I got to go to musical events, political meetings. Briefly, we had some left-wing socialist theory discussion groups, although none of them lasted very long. I'm grateful for those exposures. It was really good. I don't have to rehash for you that the bird finally ceased publications somewhere around 75, 76.
Mm-hmm.
And then briefly tried to resume publication, and I tried to help fund that, but it wasn't sufficient. When it looked like Ronald Reagan was going to get re-elected in 1984, the bird came back to the scene, and we said, you can't believe this is going to happen. And it did, and we failed. We failed to take down Ronald, whatever that guy's name is,
right.
Ronald and Donald.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to take a break if we could. Can we take a break right now?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm simply in need of another bathroom break, so let me go.
So we're just coming back from a little break and have looked at our watches and how long we've been talking today, and also projecting what else we might want to talk about, what ground to cover, and decided that we're going to schedule another session to continue on with the story. So we'll do that, and we'll close for today. So thank you again for journeying down to Georgia State and spending the time to...
My pleasure. I appreciate your wonderful openness to hearing where the story takes us, and it's taken us quite a ways. What's left for me to share is probably the portions beyond the bird's demise, but the relationships there have supported me and Mickey, and we've supported each other in the subsequent years, which include more types of activism and being parents, and now, for the last 6 years, grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
And I can share some of that and wonder with you what the future holds. Thanks. So I look forward to coming back.
Perfect. Thank you.